Late at night, deep in the forest, a man stood. He left behind traces of blood staining the bright green grass. He let out groans of pain as blood continued to flow onto the ground. His breathing was ragged. A knife was sticking out of his heart, but he continued to move forward with the last of his strength. He didn't want to believe that he would die like this. In his imagination, death should have been completely different. Eventually, the man's strength left him and he fell to his knees on the ground. Every movement was painful and every breath felt like the last. He stopped struggling. His body was weak and he fell completely onto the soft grass. The fireflies turned on their flashlights nearby in the bushes. The forest was surprisingly quiet and only a faint hoarse breathing frightened this silence. After lying down for a while, the man opened his eyes and, gathering all his remaining strength, dug his fingers into the ground. He tried to raise himself. This was accompanied by almost a scream, which the angry man tried hard to contain. He managed to roll over onto his back, but the movement took the last of his strength. When the sharp pain from the movement subsided slightly, the man opened his eyes again. I looked at the night sky strewn with stars and thought that such a view is quite romantic for the last minutes of life. He understood that this was probably really his end, but suddenly a boy appeared right in front of him. He looked at him sternly, trying to answer the question of what the young man was doing there, but he remained silent. The man did not know this boy, and confirmed this to himself. The man laughed. His enemies called themselves famous martial artists, and he expected them to attack him one by one, but they vilely attacked him all at once. Someone used the emperor's sword technique. Someone used the fury of the holy lion, and someone a blow of death. These people placed big bets on who would be able to defeat their only enemy at that moment. The man laughed and asked them about their pride, which was clearly lost. Then a serious battle took place, which many would soon start talking about. The man jumped up in bed in horror. It was a very bad dream caused by personal experience. He woke up in bed with bandaged wounds. He sat up in bed and exhaled heavily. The serious wounds were making themselves known and restricting his movements. Trying to stand up brought the man even more suffering. The pain was so strong that his body was covered in sweat and began to tremble violently from helplessness. With difficulty, he got to his feet and leaned against the wall. The man was surprised at his location and, in general, at the fact that he was still alive. He looked around and decided that it was worth going out into the yard, seeing the open doors. The man moved very carefully towards the exit, struggling with the pain in his body. The weather outside was wonderful. The sun was shining brightly and warming with its rays. The variety of herbs amazed with their color and smell. In the yard there was an exit to the river with a waterfall. The water made a pleasant noise and splashed on the sides. The view was stunning. Everything around lived, protected from harm by high cliffs. The man was barely able to stand on his feet. Suddenly a voice came from behind him, telling him that he was not yet allowed to get up. The man immediately asked where he was. Turning around, he saw the same boy he had seen in the forest before he passed out, who responded by saying that he needed to rest. The man tensed up and asked the boy who he was. The boy introduced himself as Danak's son and smiled awkwardly. The man was clearly surprised and pointed out that he had not asked for a name. The boy did not understand what he should have answered and looked at the gentleman in confusion. But finally the boy smiled and said that he had saved the man's life. The man was surprised that a child had saved him, and the boy explained that he was a doctor. Heading to the entrance of the house, Danak's son noted that the man had almost died and suggested going inside and having a proper talk there. The man was still surprised that it was the boy who had treated him and decided not to hide it. Danak's son looked at the man and emphasized that there was no one else in the area and no one except him could attack the man or heal his wounds, and asked him to come in and finally lie down. The man didn't like the boy's tone and asked if his savior knew who was standing in front of him. The young man turned around and stepped onto the threshold of the house and said that he was just a wounded man. Danak asked the man to hurry, explaining that if he did not continue the treatment, it would be difficult to restore his former health. The man could not even imagine how much effort it took to save him. The man decided not to return, obeyed and followed the young man, lay down on the bed and allowed himself to be treated further. The young man laid out a bundle of tools on the bed, suggesting that they begin immediately. There were needles on this day. Danak pulled out one of them, which turned out to be quite long and sharp. The man tensed up and asked if that needle was the very same needle of immortality. The young man was glad that his guest understood this. The man asked where the boy got the legendary item of the divine healer from, and he answered that he was his son. At that moment, the young man warned that he would now press on the acupuncture points, and the man groaned in pain. He could not believe that the boy was affecting the demonic and subjugating points at the same time. Very quickly, the doctor placed many needles all over the man's body. It was amazing, but the pain immediately began to go away. The man began to believe that this guy could actually be the son of a divine healer, which meant that if he really had inherited his healing skills, he would be able to heal such terrible wounds and get the man back on his feet. He was confident that the doctor would fight for the patient's life with his gestures until his very last breath. As far as he remembered, the divine healer treated only those who adhered to the bright path. But for 20 years now, he has disappeared without a trace from the world of martial arts. It was surprising that, considering that even the intelligence service had combed everything around, the doctor was never found, but he still managed to have a child. While the young man was being treated, the man couldn't get this out of his head. When the doctor finished, the man asked why he saved him. The young man looked at him in surprise and asked if the doctor really needed a reason to save his patient. The man replied that as far as he knew, the divine healer had only treated those who followed the bright path throughout his life. Danak smiled and replied that since the man was not one of them, that changed the matter. The gentleman slightly raised his head and asked whether the young man would answer the question or not. The doctor apologized for his laughter and noted that everything was difficult to explain, but the first thing was that he was not his father. The young man explained that he had always been taught to save others, but the man had only one life to cherish, and there were likely to be those who would have a hard time coping with his loss. The gentleman laid his head back on the pillow and exhaled, saying that there were no people who would mourn after his death. The doctor smiled and, not believing the gentleman's words, replied that he personally would be sad if something like this were to happen. Then the young man took out another package and from there took a different game, different from the previous ones. The man, seeing this, realized that the needle was demonic and tensed up even more. To the surprise of the doctor that the gentleman knew about this item, the man emphasized that it was impossible not to know about the legendary item of the demonic doctor who commands life and death. And, along with the holy healer, the woman Stochoa is at the top of alternative medicine, and she disappeared on the same day as the divine healer. Known for her character as unusual as her abilities, she healed those who followed the dark path. The young man smiled and replied that the woman was his mother. This shocked the man. It was surprising that the divine and demonic healers got married. The boy was focused on his work, and almost without being distracted from the process, he noted that this was why he appeared in this world, although it sounded strange. He carefully took the demonic needle and warned the man that it might hurt a little. When the doctor inserted the needle, the gentleman cried out loudly in pain, and for a moment lost contact with his mind from the pain. Danak smiled and apologized, noting that he forgot about acupuncture and fixed everything. The man continued to moan in pain, although he tried to restrain himself. 3 days later, the gentleman woke up and felt much better. He got out of bed without much effort. He was alive and knew he was getting better. He was still surprised by what had happened these days and who exactly was treating him. But he still considered the son of a divine demonic healer to be an incredible monster in a good way. The gentleman got up very early and, looking around, was surprised that the young man was no longer at home. He was curious about what business the doctor could have at such an early hour. Danakson went to the mountains to search for certain plants that could be useful to him in his practices. To get them, you had to overcome a rather difficult path and climb one of the rocks. Well, despite this difficult path, when the doctor saw the plant he needed, he smiled sincerely and happily. The plant was growing in a very hard-to-reach place. Danak reached for it, hoping that he would be able to pick the plant that way. There was very little left, but the doctor still could not reach the stem. But as soon as the young man managed to pull out the plant, the stone he was holding onto collapsed. The doctor's cry could be heard throughout the entire area, and the gentleman could probably hear it from the house. With difficulty, the doctor still managed to obtain the necessary plant and get back home. As soon as he got home, the young man hurried to his patient and sat down in front of him on a chair and took out the medicinal herbs he had obtained. The gentleman was very surprised that Danak was ready to give his life for these herbs and went through such a difficult path to obtain them. The boy smiled happily and explained that these were not simple herbs, but the spiritual root itself, without which it was impossible to heal the master's internal injuries. The gentleman thought for a moment and asked the boy a question. He was bothered by the fact that the doctor was not interested in who he was trying so hard to cure. Danak's expression changed, and he replied that he was more delighted than surprised that the gentleman had managed to survive despite such serious injuries. Afterwards, the boy noted that he was curious about something else. He said that if he knew the causes of injuries, then it became easier to treat them, and noted that he was talking about a secret weapon that was stuck in the gentleman's shoulder. The man asked if the boy meant a fatal blow. The doctor very emotionally confirmed this and emphasized that it had caused him a lot of inconvenience since it was very difficult to extract this weapon. The doctor noted that the weapon itself looked quite frightening since there was still poison inside it. The gentleman explained that it was a dart. It was a secret weapon that only the head and elders of the Tang family could use. The doctor said that he thought so because the weapon was very complex to make. The master thought that the young doctor was able to neutralize even the secret poison of the Tang family. It was hard to believe even though he had witnessed it himself. The gentleman thought that if he had not met the Dr. Dan, none of the miracles he spoke of would have happened. Deciding not to waste time, the doctor said, "They will use the needles in advance today, as he needs to go to the village." To the gentleman's question about selling herbs, the doctor replied that he really was going to trade a little and buy some things. The gentleman responded by saying that he was very grateful to the doctor for allowing him to stay at his home and scolded himself for not even being ashamed. The doctor replied that he would take care of everything and asked the gentleman not to worry. The gentleman replied that as soon as he felt better, he would find the money for the medicine himself. But if he returned to himself, there would be no problems with money. The doctor smiled and asked to bring as much as possible because high-quality medicinal herbs would speed up the treatment. And then the young man explained that the gentleman was strictly forbidden to leave the house, which made the man smile, and then he smiled and replied that the young man was a real doctor. Dan AKU didn't really like this expression, and the man had to immediately start apologizing and explaining that he had simply misspoke. In short, I didn't answer anything and started to take a box of needles out of my bag. The gentleman immediately tensed up because he understood what awaited him in the next few minutes. The young man, seeing the tense look of the gentleman, asked him not to worry and explained that today they were using his father's method. The gentleman chuckled and began to deny that he was worried and to claim that he would endure the methods of the demonic healer. He explained that his father's method worked more slowly, but it was more stable and was easier to tolerate. But his mother's method worked faster, but it was very painful. The doctor noted that in some cases both techniques were necessary. The gentleman asked the young man not to worry, because for the sake of his own life, he was ready to endure any pain. Taking advantage of the moment of silence, the man stood up and asked the doctor not to tell anyone about him when he went to the village. The doctor promised not to tell anyone without further questions. The gentleman was even more surprised that the boy was not interested in this, to which he replied that the masters of the martial arts world had their own history, and in general it was not worth asking about it. Having explained his position, the young doctor set to work. Taking the game out of the box, he carefully aimed at the right point where he should stick the needle. Indeed, the new method turned out to be much more tolerant than the previous one. It was difficult for the gentleman to bear such pain, but at that moment he was able to hold on. He didn't scream or moan from the intense pain, but only closed his eyes tightly. "You, sir," said to the doctor for so long, and paused, that in the current world of martial arts there were many villains. He said that it could be rumors, but in their time, there were 10 powerful villains. They were called the 10 Great Villains. Among them was the most powerful and extremely dangerous man known as the leader of the 10 Great Villains, the Absolute Evil. After a short pause, the gentleman said that he was this Absolute Evil. After finishing the acupuncture, the doctor took out another set and asked the gentleman to turn over onto his stomach to give him the opportunity to treat his back. The gentleman, rising, looked at the boy with a completely puzzled look. The doctor did not react to his story in any way. He continued and said that there were also 5 strongest martial artists, regardless of which path they followed, light or dark. They were called the 5 strongest masters in the world, and he was the 5th among them. The doctor remained silent and continued to do his job, sticking needle after needle into the gentleman's back one by one. Ignored the gentleman's last words. The man looked at the boy and asked if he was frightening him. The doctor smiled and reminded him who his mother was. Denak noted that his parents said that all martial artists were the same. They said that in the martial arts world, good and evil were erased. The gentleman asked again about the boundaries, and the doctor answered that there were those who harm ordinary people, that is, the bad ones, and others were just the good ones. After thinking for a bit, the doctor asked the gentleman which side he personally was on. The gentleman became serious and swore that he only killed those who wished him harm or were a fellow martial artist. The doctor, hearing this, smiled and said that in that case the gentleman was a good man, which made the gentleman himself laugh very much. The procedure was over and the gentleman was able to get up. Sitting down on the couch, he thought for a bit and decided to ask what he was very curious about. The gentleman asked where your parents were, the doctor, and clearly caused some inconvenience with such a question. Dr. Dan's face quickly changed and he quietly said that his parents were no longer there. The man did not expect such an answer and worried asked how it happened. The doctor continued to collect all his instruments and still did not answer the gentleman's question. The man stood up and walked closer to the doctor, still hoping to hear an answer. But the boy just smiled and pulled the strap of his bag over his shoulder. The doctor hurried to the village market, and as if nothing had happened, waved his hand to the gentleman and said that he had left. The gentleman sat back down on the couch and scratched the back of his head, thinking that he was not only shameless, but also tactless. Dr. Dan reached the village quite quickly. The first thing he did was go to the shop of one of the merchants. Entering, he greeted them politely. The gentleman immediately recognized him and greeted him with respect. The boy asked the gentleman how he was doing, and he replied that he was doing wonderfully thanks to the doctor and asked a similar question. The boy answered briefly that he would do it and put the bag on the table. The gentleman was very surprised, but pleased that the young man, as usual, brought everything of the highest quality and said that as promised, he would give 10% on top. Dr. Dan thanked him, but asked for medicinal herbs instead of money. The gentleman invited the boy to see for himself, knowing that he always chose the herbs himself. While the boy was choosing what he needed, the merchant noted that he always went to the same place. The doctor smiled and replied that this place reminded him of his mother and father. The gentleman looked at the boy with some sadness. He felt very sorry for the child who was left without both parents very early. At that moment, someone stepped onto the threshold with a very heavy step. 3 men appeared at the door. One of them in the center asked if they had arrived at the village medical home. The merchant looked at his guests suspiciously and replied that they had most likely ended up in a simple herbal shop, emphasizing that the village was rather poor for such a thing. Another man asked the merchant if he had seen a stranger in the village. The gentleman was surprised by the question. The men emphasized that the stranger was most likely seriously injured, and the merchant replied that he had not seen anyone like that. One of the men doubted the merchant's bed, but asked if there was a hospital or a doctor nearby. The gentleman looked at the boy and wanted to say that he was the doctor. The boy was busy and didn't pay attention to the fact that 3 unfamiliar men were looking at him and continued to choose the necessary ingredients, humming some melody. The merchant pointed his finger at him and started shouting that this boy had come to his shop again and reminded the young man that everything had to be paid for. One of the men, hearing this, asked to pass on information about the permanent home to them if the merchant suddenly encountered someone strange. Dr. Dan glanced carefully at the men, hearing perfectly well what they said. The man promised to generously reward the merchant for the information, but warned that if he hid anything, he would regret it, because that stranger was the worst of all the villains in the world, and whoever would help him would also get what he deserved. The merchant turned pale and stuttered from worry, and replied that he understood everything and would definitely warn the men if he suddenly noticed someone suspicious. Having received a satisfactory answer, the men left the shop and went outside and began to look around. The doctor approached the merchant and after a short silence said that those who harmed ordinary people were bad. The merchant in response drew the boy's attention to the fact that in recent days the village had been going through hard times and it was better to be more careful. Danak smiled and promised that he would be very careful. By evening, the doctor got home and told the gentleman what he had seen. He suggested that it could have been an alliance of martial arts masters. The gentleman agreed with this and emphasized that they would not calm down until they were sure of his death. He said that they had recently announced that they would catch him and a couple of other masters to deal with them, and the rest were now also uneasy. The doctor said that his mother always said that martial arts masters never changed. The gentleman smiled and noted that now he had problems from the doctor. He smiled and asked the gentleman not to worry, explaining that his house was difficult to find, and at the entrance, in addition, there was protection. The gentleman was surprised that the boy was ready to continue treating him despite the risks. The doctor smilingly noted that the patient had not yet recovered and needed help at least until he could move independently. The gentleman asked why the boy was doing this, and he replied that no one else was capable of doing this. For a moment, the gentleman thought about it and then turned to the boy. Exhaling, he asked if he could bring another person to his home. The doctor asked if this person was another patient, and the gentleman replied that his symptoms were worse. The doctor immediately became interested and asked what symptoms the man had. Seeing the young man's eyes light up, the gentleman exhaled and replied that this was a unique case. He said that this man was overcome with madness every time he saw blood again. This man was capable of many things. He could from that time on do very bad things when he gave in to this evil inside himself. The mountain river was raging. The waves were beating against the cliffs, trying to break them. The gentleman rose quite high up. Having overcome another height, he stopped and exhaled. He kept his promise to return to the doctor in 10 days in his head. Although he was just a boy, the gentleman believed that he had no right to let him down. When the gentleman told the doctor about his friend, he was very happy and started talking about such an interesting case. The gentleman was surprised why the young man was so happy. The doctor replied that first of all, these were unique symptoms and asked if he could see this man. The gentleman replied that there was one problem, which was that this man was one of the 10 great villains. The doctor noticed that the gentleman was also one of the 10. The man noted that they were completely different. Dan, aka, was not afraid of this and wanted to see this man. The gentleman hoped that thanks to this, he would be able to cover the cost of treatment, because in his hiding place, you can find a couple of valuable items. The doctor smiled, noting that they would kill two birds with one stone, and asked where he should look for this man. The gentleman replied that he would go himself, since only he would be able to convince him. On top of everything else, the gentleman added that he could not expose the doctor to any more danger, and ruffled the boy's hair. When asked if the doctor would cope, the gentleman only warned that the man, in addition to being mad, was very peculiar. The boy smiled again and asked who could be more peculiar than his parents. The gentleman laughed and noted that the boy was right, and decided to set off on his journey immediately. In order to move more easily, the gentleman needed a cane, on which he constantly leaned. He walked slowly and looked around carefully. Seeing the destroyed rock, the gentleman thought to himself that his acquaintance remained as hot-tempered as before and destroyed absolutely everything around. Having reached a huge stump, the gentleman sat down and then took out a fairly large bottle from his bosom. After looking at him for a moment and sighing, the gentleman threw the bottle on the ground in front of him. The bottle shattered, releasing dark purple smoke. The smoke was picked up by the wind and carried around the area. The gentleman could only wait. He closed his eyes to gather his strength and prepare for the meeting. Very soon, a huge man appeared not far from the gentleman. He jumped from one of the rocks. From his jump, the earth shook and the birds rose high above the ground. The man was very angry. His eyes flashed a bright red light. He looked straight at the master. Without thinking for long, the man jumped up and ran at him. He was ready to attack, but the gentleman did not even open his eyes. Suddenly, the veil of evil fell from the man's eyes. He came to his senses and froze in place. He screamed, not expecting to see his brother Cho, and carefully raised his weapon so as not to hit him. The gentleman opened his eyes and, looking at his old friend, grinned. The giant examined his friend and asked what was going on, noting that it could not be that the great bloody fist had given up its position so easily. The gentleman, rising, asked not to pay attention to this and to get ready quickly. The giant replied that judging by the voice and appearance in front of him, it was definitely Brother Cho. He still did not fully believe it. The man asked where they were going, to which the gentleman replied that the Alliance of Martial Arts Masters should arrive soon. The giant was surprised and asked why, while the gentleman grimaced and asked not to tell him that he knew nothing. The man really looked very surprised and was taken aback by such news and questions. The gentleman looked at him and said that the Alliance of Martial Artists promised to destroy 10 great villains. This enraged the giant. He began to get indignant and shout that everything had calmed down only recently, and now it was starting again. He was ready to take some measures right away, but the gentleman asked him to stop and pay attention to his condition. The man immediately came to his senses and bowed as a sign of respect, and replied that the gentleman was right and that he looked as if he was about to die. The brute smiled broadly and mockingly asked if the greatest master of the 10 great villains had shamefully defeated the Alliance of Martial Artists. The gentleman asked very displeasedly why the giant had decided to talk to him informally. Mr. Cho quickly lost his temper. He hissed that he had come to save the giant in such a terrible state, and he should stop wasting time and get ready right now. The man loudly asked when the gentleman began to worry about him so much, and reminded him that wasn't he the one who said that he would rip out his beard and shove it somewhere far away if necessary. Mr. Cho shouted even louder, reminding that he too had been promised that his eyes would be gouged out to make the decoration. The men argued for a while. The gentleman stopped it very abruptly and exhaled, asking them to go and talk on the way. The giant asked where he was in a hurry, considering that they had plenty of time. The brute took a fighting stance and shouted that he would wait for the Alliance there, and as soon as they came, he would smash their heads. The gentleman asked to postpone this slaughter and first cure the disease. The brute looked at the gentleman in surprise and asked what illness he was talking about, and the gentleman reminded him of the nuance with the blood. Gramella responded that if someone was capable of this, he would turn the whole world upside down to find such a person. The gentleman replied that you were such a person. You said that you had found a demonic healer who was able to cure such a divine punishment. This shocked the giant. The gentleman, seeing the surprised face of his friend, smiled broadly and added that this doctor was also divine. Without wasting any time, the two of them headed back to the healer dam AKU. The giant's weapon was not simple and could carry him anywhere through the air. The two of them sat on it like a bench and talked on their way home. The giant was angry that the gentleman was constantly fidgeting and had no desire to rub bodies with him. The gentleman smiled and noted that if he wanted to be cured, he should shut up and fly forward. The gentleman noted that it was most likely madness that prevented the giant from developing martial arts. If they corrected this, he would be able to become stronger, and then even the alliance of martial arts masters would dare to touch him. The giant shouted that the gentleman had arranged only to say where it was, but in response, he said that he knew that they wanted to throw him. You know that a conversation about trust began between them, and it turned out that no one trusted each other. Then they flew in complete silence, each thinking about the past dialogue. Mr. Cho thought that he lied to Dr. Dan, but this man was really very difficult to bring. It was a shame that he lost to the Alliance and also had to ask for money. He was a great bloody fist, later with dozens of great villains. Well, at that moment he felt incredibly pathetic. After a short, rather unpleasant journey, the masters arrived at the doctor's court. The boy had already met them and noted that they returned very quickly. The giant smiled and asked if the demonic healer was there and asked to get to him quickly. The boy's eyes widened and she replied that she had died. And then the giant asked to bring the divine healer, to which the boy replied that he too had died. The giant was already getting angry and turned to Mr. Cho and asked what was going on. He smiled and explained that this guy was their son. Mr. Cho said that this boy inherited all their skills and was a full-fledged doctor. The giant began to be indignant that such a short man could not be a doctor and suggested that the Alliance had knocked all the brains out of the gentleman. The gentleman smiled and noted that the giant himself confirmed his terrible condition. The giant heard that the master was standing on his feet. Only thanks to this boy, he still could not believe what he heard. He did not understand how this tiny bean sprout could do something like that. These words angered the gentleman. He asked the giant to watch his words, sternly called him by name, and emphasized that the boy had saved his life. This man suffering from a strange disease was called Bom-K-Wee. Bom-K. V thought to herself that the gentleman's dying state was just an act. Well, he smiled and promised that it would not happen again, and asked why the gentleman was so serious. The boy decided to interrupt this strange dialogue and suggested checking the pulse first. He didn't want to delay treatment for long. The doctor immediately took both men into the house and began examining them. He sat Bom-K-Wee down on a stool and began to feel her pulse. After listening to the heartbeat for a bit, and most likely feeling something else, the doctor replied that the treatment would not be easy. He explained that the most problematic thing was that the energy of the Bom-K-Wee meridian was disrupted. So when he used his internal energy to the full, the protection of his brain was disrupted. This really amazed the giant. The giant turned to Mr. Cho, indignant that he had told him his secret. The gentleman explained that he had only told him that he went crazy at the sight of blood. Igor continued to say that the second problem was related to the chi energy in his left hand because of the terrible state of the meridian center of his heart. It was very difficult to bend his hand. The boy suggested that he might have recently been injured. Then the doctor decided that the information should only be given to the patient and whispered in his ear. After listening to the doctor, Bom-K-Wee was very surprised. Well, apparently he began to believe the boy's words. He began to ask whether the young man would really be able to cure all of this, and when the boy confirmed that everything would work out, he said that in that case, he would trust him. The doctor smiled and asked him to bow his head for a second in that case, and when the giant did what he was asked, the boy asked him to breathe calmly. With a very light and quick movement, the doctor placed one of the needles right in the center of the head, causing Bom-K-Wee to scream. Very quickly, the giant looked very peaceful and relaxed. Mr. Cho smiled, happy that his man had a chance to be cured. The doctor left the new patient and quickly walked up to Mr. Cho. He was extremely passionate about his work, and it was clear that the boy was glowing with joy. With such a quick, easy movement, the doctor inserted another needle right into the center of the gentleman's chest. The next moment, the gentleman became just as relaxed. Well, it didn't last long because the doctor immediately removed the needle and let some blood. The gentleman was wary because his blood was black, but that was not the only problem. The gentleman immediately jumped up and grabbed the boy, jumped to the side, shouting that it was worth being careful, because he warned that his friend was an animal of that kind of blood. The giant fell from the chair and trembled violently. But nothing happened next. The doctor smiled, and Mr. Cho was amazed by what he saw. Bam Ki-wee raised his eyes and looked at the guys with a trembling voice, and asked if he was really cured, since he didn't attack anyone and could control himself. Mr. What said that it was quite strange because usually his eyes would immediately roll back, and then the worst would happen. The doctor smiled and reminded him of his promise to cure. But then the boy explained that it would take some time for a full recovery, and the giant again sank into his previous state, completely relaxed. He carefully knelt down before the boy and bowed. He called the boy Master, but the boy asked him to call him simply Dr. Dan. The procedures lasted a very long time, and only when night fell did the doctor let the gentleman go to rest. He himself went about his business and, sitting down at the table, began to make some notes. The young man was completely immersed in his own affairs, being pleased that he had the opportunity to practice his skills and help someone. Everything was going well, but suddenly, the doctor stopped writing, hearing something. He jumped up and ran towards the exit of the house, very excited. Loud shouts and insults could be heard in the yard. Bam Ki-wee screamed that he had nothing to thank Master So for, and that he had only lured him here because he needed money. The master said that he had saved his life by warning him about the alliance. Otherwise, he would have fallen straight into their hands. Mr. Cho noted that the doctor's treatment was a separate merit. The giant replied that he himself treats for his own treatment and recovers, and other doctors will risk their lives to get him with such money. Mr. Cho began to lose his temper and shouted at him to find another doctor, to which the giant shouted that he was not at all weak to do so. By this time, the boy was already near them, and having heard everything, he asked in confusion if Mr. Vi was going to leave. Bam Ki-wee told the boy that he would return as soon as Mr. Cho died, but the doctor asked him to wait. He immediately took out some check with the desire to return all the money if he wanted to study with another doctor. The giant remembered that he had paid in advance, but asked the guy to keep the money and fix the house. Turning around, Bam Ki-wee headed towards the exit from the courtyard, which the master and the doctor watched silently. Realizing that the man was really leaving, the doctor asked if he really needed it. Let me remind you that an alliance of martial arts masters was looking for him. The giant slung his weapon over his shoulder and replied that the alliance should fear him, because he would kill everyone who caught his eye. Mr. Cho shouted that it was not too late and suggested staying anyway. The giant turned around abruptly and shouted to who needed it, hinting that it definitely wasn't him. Bam Ki-wee was very hurt and angry and did not want to stay in that yard for even an extra second, and immediately the air flew up. Mr. Cho was not at all surprised and said that this was the kind of character the man had. The doctor asked why they had quarreled. It seemed they were close to each other and asked not to say if it was hard. Mr. Cho replied that it was not that, but he was just a little embarrassed and reminded that he and Bam Ki-wee were among the top 10 great villains. Mr. Cho was the leader and Bam Ki-wee was the third person of the 10, but he always said that he actually deserved the second place. In general, this was the only reason for any quarrel between them. The boy was waiting for a continuation of this story and some other explanations. The gentleman looked at him and replied that that was all, and there was nothing more to talk about. The boy did not understand how it was possible to fight over something like this and asked whether the problem was actually something else. Mr. Cho replied that every time he was around that guy, something always happened. Bam Ki-wee never returned, having moved as far away from the doctor's court as possible. He went into the forest and found a secluded place and tried to figure out what was going on. Such situations made him very angry, and now they brought him to despair. After acupuncture, his mind cleared, and he forgot about it, and he thought that it was not worth starting the treatment. Suddenly, in front of him in the thickets, he saw the silhouette of an animal with glowing eyes. A tiger slowly walked into the clearing, and Bam Ki-wee carefully stood up on his feet and prepared to defend himself. The tiger held his prey in his teeth, but seemed not to mind another one. Bam Ki-wee prepared for the upcoming fight with the animal. As Bam Ki-wee ran towards the beast, it crouched and cowered, and fear flashed in its eyes. They met each other's eyes. But the tiger could not stand it, and with a pitiful meow, abandoned his prey and ran back into the thicket. The giant looked at the dead deer. He smelled blood. The smell and sight of blood immediately activated his illness. His mind quickly became foggy. The villain's eyes immediately began to fill with blood, and his pupils narrowed significantly. His muscles began to grow right before his eyes. His body was filled with energy. He shouted loudly, proclaiming his power throughout the area. It seemed like the place where he was about to explode from the incredible power that Bam Ki-wee was radiating. The man jumped up and flew forward, not really looking at the road or his goal. He was quickly overcome by an evil that he still could not contain within himself. The whole fox was frightened by his presence and the evil that lurked within him. All living things that were around hid in their holes and looked for secluded places to hide. But one of the greatest villains of the 10 could no longer be stopped. His illness was still progressing. At that moment, he was ready to crush everything that was in his path and tear apart everyone he met. He was able to come to his senses only at dawn, when he had managed to cause a lot of trouble. He stood amidst the shattered rocks and broken trees. His staff stuck out among the rocks. Bamkewi was trying to catch his breath after a hard night, but suddenly something sharply pierced his head, and he immediately lost consciousness. He fell to the ground with a crash. 2 human silhouettes were visible behind him. Mr. Cho and Dr. Dan found him, and the boy made sure that they were able to return the giant and continue the treatment. Mr. Cho also continued his treatment. I understand how important it was for him to fully recover and get rid of the consequences. Bam Kaewi, who was forced to continue treatment, also meekly underwent his procedures. The two of them sat opposite each other in a kind of meditation and underwent treatment from the healer. The boy gave them some herbs, asking them to chew them. Mr. Cho was thoughtful, looking at the plants. The day before, the doctor, tugging at his hand, shouted that Bam Kev wouldn't go far with such outbreaks of illness and asked to bring him back. Then, sir, ask the boy to forget about it. I think it wasn't worth going after someone who left on his own. But the young man insistently shouted that this man was his patient and he had to finish the treatment. And for Mr. Cho, this was another confirmation that the boy was indeed a very good doctor. Another confirmation of this was his friend, who was now sitting humbly injected with special needles and chewing medicinal herbs. Soon a boy came and said that it was time to remove the needles. The doctor approached Bam Keewi, and before he began to remove the needles, asked him to promise something. The boy asked him not to go alone anymore, to which Bam Keewi replied that he usually doesn't promise anything to anyone. The young man explained that he was very worried about him, which greatly surprised the villain. The young man replied that his feelings were very sincere and it was clear that the situation that had happened had upset him greatly. Bam Keewi could see his father's gaze in the boy's eyes. Thanks to this, he promised the doctor that he would no longer walk alone. He promised that he would no longer leave the yard without the boy's permission. The doctor smiled. Your promise made him very happy and gave him some relief. The procedures for Bam Keewi continued with strict regularity. Each time, the doctor carefully placed the needle into the center of the man's head. It was very serious and responsible, and the girl always looked appropriate for her job. Thanks to this needle, Bam Keewi's body felt an incredible relief. The light inside him spread more and more. Bam Keewi considered the girl a genius because she was so small but already knew so much. He did not hide his admiration and told the doctor directly that although he did not understand medicine, he considered her simply amazing, although the doctor laughingly claimed that he was exaggerating. Bam Keewi said that he couldn't even imagine how many miracles he had already managed to perform for the girl and asked her how many people she had managed to save, to which she honestly replied that none. The giant did not expect such an answer and asked how this could be. The doctor smiled and explained that Mr. Cho and Bam Keewi were her first patients. With this information, Bam Keewi immediately hurried to his leader, who was no less surprised. Mr. Cho couldn't control his emotions. He was extremely shocked that the two of them became the first patients. Bam Keewi claimed that the girl said so directly. The healer herself approached them and confirmed that this was true, which frightened the men even more. Bam Keewi turned to the girl and asked her not to say that she was practicing on them, and she assured him that this was certainly not the case. She said that she first treated a person when she was 4 years old, but he was a patient of his parents. Back then, she had only used needles and prescribed herbs as her parents had taught her. And now it was her first time applying a solution and finding a treatment method on her own. With particular sadness, the healer said that there had been no one in her yard for a long time after her parents had passed away. She looked after this huge valley of the divine and demonic healers all alone. She assured that, of course, all this time, she was learning to apply the skills that her parents passed on to her, and now she can finally show the results of her efforts. These words touched the huge Bam Keewi so much that he even burst into tears and did not know what to answer. The girl replied that there was no need to cry and that they could just chat, which she really liked, and then asked what the men had been doing in the last few hours. Some of the greatest villains unanimously answered that they were doing household chores, afraid of upsetting a small child. Mr. Cho, shaking out the sheet, emphasized that the doctor should now focus only on medicine and leave all other matters to them. As soon as the gentleman waved the cloth, it tore. The gentleman was surprised at how thin the fabric was, but the girl reacted to it completely differently. She was shocked by what she saw, and her mouth involuntarily opened in horror. Bamke Vai, digging in the ground, added that he also helped and pulled out various weeds, and asked if he did it correctly. The girl was even more shocked because these were not weeds, but her medicinal herbs. Bamkeav, hearing this, was a little embarrassed and suggested that in that case they should simply be replanted. But the plant he was going to transplant actually turned out to be a weed. The healer rolled her eyes, not knowing what to say. A short moment later, she collapsed unconscious. The men immediately ran to her and began trying to bring the girl back to consciousness. As she came to, Dr. Dan heard the men arguing among themselves about how they should have helped much earlier. Mr. Cho was indignant that the girl cleaned, cooked, collected herbs, and treated them on her own, and of course she could not withstand such a load. And they, in turn, should have monitored this and helped in every possible way. Bom Kaewi shouted that he was going to bring workers from the village, but Mr. Cho did not like the idea because many people could find out about their location. The doctor sighed heavily, hearing their argument. The man was glad that the girl had finally woken up and began asking how she was feeling. The doctor, raising herself, replied that she had probably just fallen asleep for a while. Bamke Wee explained that it was called fainting, not sleep, but the girl assured him that she was fine and laughed a little. Having risen, the girl again noticed the scraps of a torn sheet, which were now lying almost all over the yard, and she became upset again. But exhaling, the girl replied that she was still going to go get some herbs and would now buy some sheets at the same time, in a completely cheerful tone. Mr. Cho was worried about where the girl was going to go in such a state. But she noted that it was absolutely impossible for men to walk for a long time, and she would manage and return by evening. Mr. Cho did not want to let the doctor go, emphasizing that there were a lot of wild animals and possibly other dangers in the forest at night. But the girl assured that she had some repellent herbs that she would take with her just in case. Bamke Wee volunteered to go to the village with the doctor, but the girl was worried that the Martial Arts Alliance might find him. Bamke Wee didn't care at all. He felt incredible strength and power in your hands. But he also had a certain peculiarity. He could hide his identity and showed it clearly. Mr. Cho, unlike the girl, was not surprised. He thought it was stupid to use the fire of samadhi just to burn his beard. Bamke Wee rubbed his smooth chin and asked others for their opinions, saying that no one should have recognized him that way. The healer noted that the villain now looked like a handsome young monk, which made the leader Cho laugh a lot, and the girl was worried that now she would have to grow a beard for a very long time. Bamke Wee explained that his beard would grow back overnight and shared that he had many other interesting abilities. Bamke Wee sat the girl on his shoulder and suggested that they set off on their journey, promising that they would arrive very quickly. Mr. Cho called out to Dr. Dan and asked him to stay for a second and listen to him. He asked the girl to find out the price of the statue when they got to the village and handed the doctor a dragon figurine. The girl really liked the statue and asked if the gentleman made it himself. Bamke Iwi agreed and noted that his brother Cho had always been distinguished by his unusual talent. The doctor noted that a product of such quality was very rare and such a statuette would be expensive. And then she asked when the gentleman had managed to make it. The gentleman became a little embarrassed and replied that while he was recovering, he had nothing else to do. He shared that he made about 50 of these statues just to kill time, and said that he really hoped that these statues would cover their expenses. Very quickly, Dr. Dan and Bamke Wee reached the nearest village. When the girl showed the dragon figurine to the merchant, he was amazed by its quality, because it looked as if the dragon was really alive, and then he asked how many of these figurines the girl had. The doctor replied that she had 50 such figures and asked how much money she could get for one. The merchant was stunned by the quantity and thought for a moment. After thinking for a bit, he replied that he would buy the figurine for 1 silver coin, and of course for 50 coins. He emphasized that this was still a very generous price, and the girl was lucky because she was unlikely to be offered more. The healer was completely dissatisfied with the merchant's answer and his greed. She took the figurine back and said that she understood everything and said goodbye to the merchant. He did not expect that his trick would not work and was worried that he would not be able to buy this figurine. Dam AKU replied that she was not going to sell it, since the merchant had named a very ridiculously low price, and it would be disrespectful to the person who made these statues. The girl headed out of the store, although the seller apparently changed his mind and asked her to stop and discuss the price again. The doctor was not very upset and told Bom KV that she had another place in mind where she could try to sell these statues. She went to another merchant and showed the figurine to him. He became interested in the product and looked at it for a long time. He said that he also needed to make a profit, but he could still buy such figures. He hesitated with the decision and openly said that probably for such a dragon in another place, the girl could be offered more. The healer smiled and asked the merchant not to worry, and said that there were many figurines. The girl showed this man the number of figurines they had brought with them. The merchant was happy and said that he really hoped for the weather because it should not get worse until he sold everything. The healer suggested in that case to leave fewer figures. But the merchant said that he wanted to buy all the figurines and would simply take them to other villages. This made Dam Aku very happy. Their conversation was interrupted by a scream. The merchant the boy had first gone to ran towards them and shouted curses and threats so that no one else would dare to buy the figurines. Bam Kui thrust his elbow out to the side very sharply, knocking the impudent merchant off his feet. This did not please this merchant very much, and he became indignant. Well, when the man saw such a giant as Bam Kui in front of him, he immediately shut up. The villain calmly ate the apple and asked the merchant with a grin what he meant. The merchant trembled with fear as he saw Bam Kui clutching the apple tightly and ready to crush it, presumably including the merchant's head. Bam Kui, in order to further frighten the merchant, crushed the huge apple with his hand while glaring at the man. The merchant squealed like a pig, thinking that he would be next. Bam Kui responded with disgust that the merchant had wet himself, but he was still a completely grown man. After that, the doctor and Bam Kui went to the herbalist's shop. The herbalist was making some notes in his book. The gentleman saw the boy and was very happy that he had the opportunity to see him again and that everything was okay with him. The gentleman was a little worried by the presence of such a giant with a not very friendly appearance next to him. The doctor whispered to Bam Kui that the gentleman selling herbs was a very good man and should be treated with kindness. Bam Kui then smiled widely at the gentleman, which greatly embarrassed him. The boy handed the gentleman the checks and explained that it was payment for her debt, and asked if the gentleman had found the medicinal herbs they had talked about earlier. The gentleman reached for the chest of drawers and replied that, of course he found them, but was simply waiting for the young man to return and take them himself. The man took out a beautiful red box and carefully placed it on the table. When he opened the box, a foul smell came out, to which Bam Kui reacted sharply and was surprised that people were even paying for it. The doctor explained that it was a medicinal herb that freed the meridians and restored blood circulation. The young man asked the seller how much he owed for this herb in that court, and she replied that the doctor could take it instead of change. The boy was a little confused and reminded that the gentleman had spoken about the high cost of this herb, to which the seller replied that they did not really value regular customers and smiled again. The young man didn't know how to react to this and was even a little indignant because he wanted everything to be fair. The gentleman walked away from the counter and noted that since the box was no longer in his hands, it belonged to the boy. The doctor looked at the gentleman and asked him to ask him a question. Afterwards, Dam Aku said that it looked like the gentleman had bought these herbs from Jinsun's hospital and that something similar had happened before. The doctor said that she was not against the gentleman bargaining with the Dr. Jinsun, but he would like his orders not to be bought by this man, otherwise he would stop doing any business with him. The gentleman felt very ashamed and promised that this would not happen again. After this, the gentleman immediately went somewhere to the hop of his shop, explaining that he had urgent business. Bam Kui asked where the said hospital was and suggested that there was something wrong with this Jinsung, but the doctor denied it. Bam Kui asked if he was a good man, and the doctor replied that he was undoubtedly a good man, and then hesitated slightly, trying to find the words. Meanwhile, Mr. Cho tried to spend his free time as usefully as possible. He went into meditation, having the opportunity to be in complete silence. He listened to his breathing and slowed down his thoughts. He was completely focused on the silence. Soon this silence was broken by the light creaking of the doors, which Bam Kui opened slightly and asked his leader to finish the practice. Bam Kui entered the room and shared his concerns that something was wrong with Dr. Dan, and explained that since they returned from the village, he had become even more obsessed with household chores. Bam Kui emphasized that the young man recently cleaned a pond and got completely wet, but he did not stop even when he was tormented by a cough. Mr. Cho asked why, to which Bam Kui noted that he had no idea, which is why he came to ask for advice. After the conversation, they went into the yard and saw that the doctor was doing the laundry and hanging out the already washed linen. Mr. Cho turned to the boy and reminded him of the contract under which he and Bam Kui were in charge of cleaning. The doctor stopped for a second and replied that he could handle it himself. It would be much better that way. Mr. Cho now understood what his friend was talking about. They didn't know what to answer the young men for some time and just stood there and looked at him silently. The gentleman approached the boy and asked him not to overdo it if he asked for help, and he agreed. After which the gentleman approached Bam Wee and called him to follow him. The giant was indignant that the leader had not convinced the boy, to which he replied that the doctor would not change his mind in any case, and that they would simply be a nuisance, and explained that Dan aka was not happy with the way they were doing their chores. Bam Wee didn't understand this, and emphasized that they were trying very hard to help. The gentleman sighed and replied that this was the problem, because some were simply incapable of it no matter how hard they tried. Bam Wee said with displeasure that apparently washing and cleaning were more difficult than martial arts, and asked what they would do, since the boy would not be able to use acupuncture with such a cough. Mr. Cho suggested that it would be worth calling a professional. Bam Wee smiled contentedly and asked to wait until he caught someone, but the gentleman emphasized that he should have called someone and not stolen, and the doctor himself should have approved such a person. Mr. Cho noted that this person must be just like them, in need of treatment and also good at cleaning. The gentleman had one such person in mind, and Bam Wee was apparently thinking about him too, but there were some problems with that. Bam Wee immediately became nervous because she didn't understand how they could implement this. Bam Wee couldn't stand it and shouted for the gentleman to quickly tell who he meant, and he would simply steal him. The gentleman exhaled and said that he meant the ice jade of immortality. Bam Wee did not expect to hear this name at all, and after asking again who exactly his leader had in mind, he received the answer that he already understood everything himself. Bam Wee was even more worried because she was the one who made everyone and everything be reflected, regardless of the light or dark path. He thought his leader was crazy. Ask him if there really isn't anyone in the whole world other than this crazy woman. The gentleman replied that it was not Bam Wee who should have spoken about this, but then he emphasized that if he was sometimes overcome by a roof, then she had none at all. Bam Wee fell to the ground in hysterics, not wanting to get involved with this woman, and said that if the leaders wanted to bring her, then let him go after her alone, and no one would stop him. The gentleman smiled and replied that he could not do this, and that he should have prepared first. It wasn't that difficult, but it did require some clever planning. The doctor continued to cough very heavily, which made both masters very worried. Mr. Cho stood at the doctor's door and listened with concern to how he was suffering from a severe cough. Having collected his thoughts, the gentleman called the doctor to him. The doctor opened the doors and invited the gentleman to come in, but he refused, and immediately said that they both had to set off on their journey soon. The gentleman explained that Bam Wee would go to the Black Dragon River province to bring another sick person, and asked if the young man approved of this. The anchor immediately asked what symptoms the person had. The gentleman said that it was something like the madness of Bam Wee himself, to which the doctor replied that in that case you can cope now you know how to treat such things, and then asked where the gentleman himself should go. The man smiled and said that he needed to check what the Martial Arts Alliance was doing. The doctor was upset and asked the man to stay. "You're alive, that the Alliance can find him." The gentleman asked the doctor not to worry because he knew what he was doing. Deciding not to argue, Dam Aku asked how long it might take. The gentleman put his hand on the boy's head and assured him that it would only take 5 days, and Bam Wee would stay for a couple more days. The doctor, after listening to the gentleman, noted that in that case he would prepare to treat a new patient. The young man said that last time they brought very good medicinal herbs, so they should help quickly. The gentleman smiled. He really liked this boy and how he was passionate about his work. He thanked the doctor for his help and he smiled at him very shyly in response. Closing the door behind the gentleman, the doctor once again asked him to be very careful. It was very noisy in one of the banquet pavilions. The celebration was in full swing. There was a man sitting at the table who looked very dissatisfied and agitated about something. He grabbed his head. Something was bothering him, and now his thoughts were only about it. The maidservants were watching him. One asked the other what was happening to the master. She explained that some beggar child had asked to give him a letter, and now their master was in such a state. The gentleman recognized the handwriting in which the letter was written. He believed that he would never forget it. The man was sure that the one who wrote this letter had been dead for a long time, and this caused him a lot of problems. He believed that the great bloody fist A.K. Ryan had been defeated, but this turned out to be untrue. The lonely cabin in the woods looked abandoned. The yard was empty and there was nothing else in the area. Inside, a man lay on the floor shaking with fear and not daring to look up. He showed his humility, although he knew that a great deal of guilt lay on his shoulders. A.K. Ryan looked at him and smiled. He was very gentle and polite only with the healer, but he did not allow such things with the others. Very pleased with himself, Ryan said that he saw that his letter had reached its address. The man on the floor, without raising his eyes, said that although his will to help the master was unchanged, he also bore responsibility for his sect and asked to understand him. He went on to say that since the matter involved an alliance of martial artists, it was extremely risky for the sect. The gentleman interrupted him and asked how many of their people had been captured. The man replied that 6 masters were captured. This meant that, apart from Ryan and Wee, only 2 of the 10 great villains remained, and the leader of the Green Forest, the sinister Hogun, the lord of the autocratic demons, No Dan Yang and others were captured. Ryan asked what happened to the lord of the autocratic demons, and the man said that he surrendered to the alliance of martial arts masters himself and now personally leads the evil destruction squad. This made the master very angry. He did not believe that the unshakable lord of the autocratic demons himself joined the bright path. Then the master ordered the man to stand up. Here he stood up with great difficulty. He could not overcome the trembling throughout his body. The man expected the worst. Mr. Cho looked at him and said that he never forgot about debts and favors. The man promised that this meeting would remain only between the 2 of them, and then corrected himself and said that he would make it so that this meeting never happened. This answer satisfied Ryan and brought a slight smile to his face. He slowly and importantly left the hut and wished to see him soon, and departed, leaving the man alone. He, still trying to tremble, was glad that at least he remained alive after this meeting and sighed heavily. The doctor continued to go about her business, and during the day went again to the nearest village to buy the necessary goods. He was very interested in how the masters were doing. He was worried about their lives, and he was also concerned about whether they were taking all their medications. While thinking about this, the boy did not see anything around him and did not notice the obstacle ahead. 3 men were passing by and happened to hit the young man, knocking him down. The doctor fell and hit his head, screaming slightly. Someone from behind helped him up and asked if he was hurt, which scared the young man a little. When he turned around, he recognized the man who had decided to help him. It was Mr. Pang. Mr. Pang spoke as loudly as he could to those men and asked if they weren't ashamed of what they had done. One of them turned around at the sound of the voice and asked again what had been said. The gentleman had no intention of leaving this situation and noted that the people were most likely from the Martial Arts Alliance, and in that case, they should have apologized if they made a mistake. The master explained that his soldiers were currently on an official mission, and the rest should simply go their own way and not interfere with anyone. Mr. Pang indignantly noted that the martial arts masters were frightening civilians and they should be ashamed of themselves for being so unreasonable. The gentleman demanded that the master state his name and position and promised that he would personally come to their alliance to officially announce what had happened. The master didn't like this behavior at all. He was called by the name of Kwok. The head of the 5th detachment of the Destroyer of Evil became interested in the name of the master. The man's name was Pang Jin Sun, from the Pang family. The master was familiar with this name and asked if the man was from the hospital. The gentleman confirmed and stated that he was in charge of this place. The doctor simply hid behind him and observed the situation. The master considered that, judging by the speech and behavior of this man, he was not the most simple person, although it was impossible to tell that he was the head of the hospital. The master noted that the gentleman had been to Lanzhou and asked what brought him to this village, to which the gentleman stated that he was not going to report to the alliance. This finally drove the master crazy, but he kept his emotions inside. He bowed his head and asked for forgiveness for the rudeness of him personally, and the people with him, and asked the master not to give vent to anger. Mr. Pang emphasized that he was not the one who should apologize and pointed to the doctor. The master apologized to the young gentleman and asked him to forgive him, the quack, with all his heart. The doctor smiled and bowed his head and returned to the master as a sign of his forgiveness. After this, the people from the alliance turned around and continued on their way. Mr. Pang noted with indignation that these people caused a lot of problems. The doctor thanked Pang Jin Sun for his help and then reminded him that he had already asked the gentleman not to look for him. The man smiled and emphasized that they had met completely by chance, although they had not seen each other for a very long time. The gentleman suggested having lunch together since they had already met, but the young man was indignant that this did not seem like an accident, and cited the incident in the herbal store as an example. The man smiled in response and insisted on continuing the conversation in the tavern, noting that they were not strangers to each other, and the young man should not have refused. The doctor didn't like this idea, but apparently he had no choice. Nevertheless, the doctor agreed, and he and the gentleman went to the tavern. One of the tables was very richly laid. The doctor understood that such a banquet had definitely been prepared in advance. The gentleman tried to convince the boy that their meeting was completely accidental and suggested that he try the dishes on the table and distract himself from bad thoughts. The doctor stood up and declared that this was to be their last meeting, and when the man continued to insist on lunch, he asked him not to change the subject. He smiled at the gentleman, laughing at the boy's behavior, and reminded him that the doctor had no one else besides him. The boy's face immediately changed and sadness came over him. He became quiet and memories flashed before his eyes. He remembered himself as a very small child. He carefully took steps forward, trying not to fall. His parents were sitting in front of him, and each of them was calling the baby to them. Little Danak wondered who to approach first and stopped halfway. He didn't choose any of the parents and turned aside, which surprised them greatly. The boy turned and ran towards the man sitting next to him. It was Mr. Pang. The Lord joyfully accepted him into his arms and called him the young Lord of the Valley. He laughed and turned to the masters and the baby's parents and boasted that their son had chosen him. The next moment that day was one of great anxiety and sadness. The gentleman noted that he knew that the doctor now often went to the village and began to buy much more herbs. The young man replied that this did not concern the gentleman, who only laughed and emphasized that only thanks to this he was able to meet him. He continued to insist the boy to eat while the food was still warm. You have not lost its taste. Dan Ak began to eat with a dissatisfied look. The gentleman assumed that the boy could be very scared and emphasized that now, in the world of martial arts, it was very unsettled. He warned that in their time there was a very sad villain named Great Bloody Fist, and the Alliance of Martial Artists recently decided to eliminate him. In fact, Mr. Pang did not frighten the boy. Listening to the man, he wondered what would happen if he told him that he was treating these very masters who were being hunted. The doctor was sure that the gentleman would gladly help, throwing aside all his affairs, because that was the kind of person he was. The gentleman asked the boy to be careful in any case, but he did not answer and looked very thoughtful. Only on the third try did the gentleman manage to call the young lord. The man asked if the food was tasty, and the young lord smiled contentedly and replied that everything was fine. Danak decided that for now he couldn't mention those masters, and in general it wasn't considered a lie. Mr. Pang watched the boy with a slight smile and thought about something of his own, finally leaving the guy with the interrogations. Bamkewi finally reached the place he needed. It was one of the valleys among the snow-capped mountains. He landed as usual, scattering fluffy snow around. He cried out indignantly and, calling the woman crazy, expressed his displeasure that he had offered to cure her illness and she had decided to thank him so badly. The woman asked if he really wanted her to fight someone like him. Snow raged around her, and with one movement of her hand, chunks of ice formed above her head. With the next movement of his hand, these ice flows, like arrowheads, flew towards Bam Kwin. He was able to dodge almost all of the ice arrows very deftly, but he couldn't get back from one of them and it hit his face. He cried out in displeasure and noted that this was already a fairly serious violation. He asked the woman to just talk to him. Adults? The girl, seeing that the master continued to talk to her, was very surprised that the blood no longer drove him crazy. Bam Kwi smiled and said that he had found a divine and demonic healer and asked if the woman had money for good but very expensive treatment. Having heard about the healers, the girl invited Bam Kwi to her residence, to her ice palace. Her name was Han Sol Hua. She had frost powers and lived remotely in the environment that suited her talents. When they came out to the residence, the girl immediately began to interrogate Bam Kwi whether his words were true and whether he really found the divine and demonic healers. The master decided to admit that he was actually talking about their son inheriting the healing techniques and asked the girl if he lied or if he had even once told that he and his brother Cho were undergoing treatment from these healers. Han Sol Hua asked what happened to the Great Bloody Fist, and Bum Kai Wee said that he was injured by the Martial Arts Alliance. The master asked why the girl called the leader brother if she, the witch, was older. The girl snorted and explained that she called all handsome men brothers, and when asked if the giant was one, she replied that he was just a stupid bald man. Bom KV shouted what was wrong with her, and the girl asked him to simply explain to her from the very beginning what had happened. The giant snorted that now she was interested in knowing what had happened. He called her crazy again, and he knew to himself that he should have tolerated this woman for the sake of the healer Dan, because he had to bring this witch to help the boy with his household chores. The giant tried to explain everything and present it in such a way that the girl would become interested and go with him. He spent all his imagination on this and practically danced in front of the witch. In the city of Harbin, the capital of the Black Dragon River province, At first glance, everything was calm. It was quiet in the Black Dragon trading house. Everything was going well until the roof of the shopping center became covered with snow and ice. Winter came to this place very quickly, although no one expected it here. People panicked at what was happening. The entire building of the trading house was covered in ice, but they could do nothing about it. Very quickly, the front door also froze over. A very icy wind rose around. Soon, Hansel Hua entered the building and brought her Winter with her into the room. She handed the man the document, and after reading it, he replied that he could not accept it and apologized. He explained that his organization was not responsible for her money and that she needed to go to the former owner of the trading house since they had paid off all the debts when they bought it. The man put up a contract for the transfer of the trading house and began to explain that they had fully paid the amount that the woman had invested. Very quickly, his face began to be covered with a layer of ice. Bom Kaewi asked where the old owner of the house was and was told that he had moved closer to the border, but there were no details. Bom Kaev took the contract, and after reading it, he was outraged by it in ancient times. This contract was 50 years old. Bom Kaev, who started to swear at the woman, that she came for the money that she invested 50 years ago, and called him stupid, but the girl only asked him to shut up. She walked forward and pulled her hands out of her sleeves with a sly smile. She came even closer and reached out her hand to the manager of the trading house, to which he began to be indignant at what the girl was doing. The girl handed him one thing and he was amazed. In front of him was jade, and what's more, it was from Kunlun. The merchant's eyes lit up, and he asked if the girl wanted to sell this thing to him. Having looked at the item more closely, the merchant said that he could give 10,000 silver for it, noting that in the capital such an item could be sold for 20, but there it was necessary to make a profit from it and deliver it, which was very difficult. Bom Kaewi was surprised that he could get so much money for a hairpin that the girl called him a fool who would never understand the value of a key hairpin. When they left the trading house, Bom Kaevi asked what happened to the rest of the debt for the treatment, noting that thanks to him, the girl would be given a discount, but the healing would take a lot of time and therefore would require about 50,000 silver. The girl looked at the master, asked him to mind his own business, and said that she would deal with everything herself. And first she wanted to check if he had lied to her. The girl walked forward, and Bom Kaewi thought about her age. He knew that this witch was already very old, but her appearance did not give it away. He couldn't even imagine how old this woman really was. The leader of the squad, Quack, sat at the table drinking heavily and thinking about the affairs of the alliance. There was an endless search and his men were already very exhausted. They called it deportation, but it was practically the same as demotion. He wanted to quickly achieve success in which the alliance of martial artists would recognize, because this was the only way he could get out of this backwater. He unleashed another message, and when he read it, he was very stupefied. He was incredibly angry and jumped up from the table and hit it loudly out of nerves. The leader of the alliance sent him a warning about the healer. Quack did not understand what was so special about him that his personality caused concern even to the leader. The people of Quack were also very interested in what was written in the letter, forbidding them to get down with their questions to their leader. Quack went to the window and told his men that Mei Rip from Janjan's faction had fled to the village they were in. The man was seriously injured, so finding him was not difficult. It was clear from the soldiers' faces that they did not really want to engage in this search, as they were incredibly tired. Turning around and seeing that all his men remained in their places, Quack literally hissed at them in anger. At that very second, everyone rushed to the exit to go search and complete their task. Quack, left alone, thought that the first thing he needed to do was solve the most important problem. He couldn't let the alliance become completely disappointed in him. Evening came very quickly. The doctor ran as fast as he could through the streets of the village. He was looking for medicinal herbs and again did not notice how evening had come. Well, he should have hurried. Even if he had gone home right away, he would have arrived only in the middle of the night. He decided to take a shortcut and turned into one of the side streets. The boy heard some sound and turned around, but did not notice anyone. The alley was completely empty, but the young man was sure that he had definitely heard something. Suddenly he noticed a heavily bloodied man under the wall of one of the houses. It was very difficult to notice him. He was breathing very heavily and groaning in pain. All his clothes were covered in blood, and it seemed he was fighting for his last minutes. The doctor immediately ran up to him and asked whether the man was wounded. The man held his stomach and with difficulty found the strength to rudely ask the guy to get away. The doctor ignored such rudeness and noted for himself that the man's bleeding was too strong. This man needed first aid as soon as possible, otherwise his life would end. The young man took a box of tools from his bag. Well, the boys couldn't do anything. Someone very sharply and roughly pulled him by the arm and lifted him to his feet. It was Quack. The master held the boy's hand high above the ground, as if he were some kind of intruder. Quack, seeing who he had come across, was surprised, but the healer himself did not recognize the master. Quack, without losing his composure, grabbed the boy and held him tightly in his grip, not allowing him to escape. With his other hand, he decided to save the life of an already wounded man. The doctor screamed, not understanding what was happening. Quack asked the boy what connected him with that man. The doctor thought to himself that this man was a cold-blooded killer who took lives without the slightest hesitation. He understood that he had to watch his words, otherwise everything could end very badly. The most important thing was not to mention the masters. The doctor tried to think of what to answer so as not to get into trouble. Quack thought that if you do everything right, you can catch Pang Jin's son, and even the head of the Alliance of Martial Artists treats him with respect. If you take advantage of the situation, he can strengthen his authority in the Alliance. Quack began to shake the boy, questioning him about his relationship with the murdered man, but the doctor remained silent. Quack tried to threaten the boy with the punishment that anyone who helped the enemy deserved. The boy remained silent and was extremely focused on something of his own. Quack smiled, realizing that luck had fallen right into his hands. Mine was very angry that the boy did not answer him, and hugging him tighter said that the boy would tell him everything anyway, and once again plunged his sword into the lying man. Blood splashed into the boy's face, but he didn't make a sound, remaining silent. A couple of days later, Bam Ki-wee and Han Sol-hwa reached the courtyard of Dr. Dan. Even before entering the young man's territory, the giant called him by name, notifying him of his return. Instead of the boy, he was met by Mr. Cho, who asked him to shout louder so that everyone would know their location. The gentleman put aside his wood carving and greeted the witch, noting how long it had been since they had seen each other. Bam Ki-wee said how late he was, and asked his brother Cho where the Dr. Dan was. The gentleman said that he went to the village for medicinal herbs, to which the giant was indignant that the boy went there alone. He was worried that wild animals could attack the young man, but the gentleman reassured him by noting that he took repellent herbs with him. Bam KV pointed out that it was already getting dark, and by the time the doctor got there, he might stumble in such darkness, and asked who would be responsible for him in that case. He was very angry and started cursing loudly. While arguing with his friend, Ryan thought that perhaps he really should have disguised himself and gone with the doctor and made sure that he got to the village and back safely. Their dialogue was interrupted by Sol-hwa, who began to express indignation at the mess that was in the yard. Bam KV was surprised. What kind of mess was she talking about? And noted that the girl should live here. This arrangement did not suit her. She thought that everything was littered with garbage. She looked around and said that in such a place even a healthy person could catch something. She immediately went into the house and asked where all the cleaning products were. Seeing this, the guys were very happy because their plan worked. They winked at each other, but Bam K-wee returned to the conversation about the doctor, worried that it was really getting dark already, and the boy was still not home. Ryan thought about it because the boy really never stayed late to have time to cook dinner. When dinner was mentioned, Bam KV noted how hungry he was. Mr. Cho himself began to worry a lot about the doctor, but for now he just silently hoped that he was okay. Meanwhile, the doctor was in a tavern called the Blue Flower. Quack locked the boy in a room to interrogate him. Not far from them was the corpse of the man from that alley. Quack doubted the veracity of the boy's words, claiming that he accidentally met the wounded man and wanted to help. He openly said that he did not believe the boy and was waiting for him to tell the whole truth. Dan Ak did not understand how long this man would ask the same question and decided to remain silent this time. But Quack was a very cruel and rude person. He grabbed the boy by the hair and pulled. Quack said that when an adult asked questions, the boy had to answer them. The doctor only said that the Alliance of Martial Artists was truly fair and honest. These words made Quack even more angry. Although it was true and the Alliance lacked honor, well, it hurt the pride of the squad leader. Quack took out a knife and threatened to cut the boy's throat if he did not answer all the questions obediently. He made a small cut and let a few drops of blood to really scare the boy. Dan Ak shouted that he had already told everything and warned that if he was asked that very question, he would not answer anymore. This seriously enraged Quack, and cursing the boy, he made a move to stab the guy with a knife, but he was interrupted. Deputy Captain Jan knocked on the door. She reported the arrival of a messenger from Jin Song's medical house. Jin Song himself came to the inn to meet her. Quack was very surprised by such guests and thought that apparently this gentleman was very worried about the boy. Dan Ak shouted that Mr. Pang should not be touched and not dragged into this showdown because he had nothing to do with it. Kwok the echidna smiled and promised that they would still have time to figure this out. Dan couldn't do anything about his situation and it made him very angry. He quickly guessed that Quack had planned to lure Mr. Pang from the very beginning and asked about it directly. Instead of answering, Quack hit the guy on the head with just one thumb, which was enough to stun him a little. Kvak said that such matters should not involve children and that adults should sort things out themselves. Night fell. A young guy was running along the road that led out of the forest. He ran with all his strength, heavily out of breath from the very long journey at such a pace. He kept telling himself that there were only 15 minutes left. He was afraid of not making it and tried to speed up as much as possible. He was just drinking with his men when suddenly trouble happened. The leader of the AI faction, So Jok-san, said that he treats everyone because the opportunity to relax was very rare. Everyone was flattered by such generosity. He was praised, and his martial arts also deserved special respect. One of the men present suggested leaving Wu Wei and heading to the Great Plain. So Jock, already quite drunk, really liked this idea and agreed to go to the Great Plain. Suddenly the door flew out and shattered into pieces, and a huge man appeared on the threshold. He snorted that everyone present was having a great time and called them a bunch of hardened scoundrels. Many did not understand who the uninvited guest was and began to be indignant at how he dared to enter their home. The man was very fast. No one had time to notice how he moved from the entrance to their leader. The leader himself understood that a martial arts master had come to them, but he still didn't understand what he wanted. He tried to raise his head and look at the unpleasant guest and asked who sent him, to which he received the answer that the man was on his own and he had a proposal. He expressed hope that he would not be denied service and squeezed the leader's head so hard that he screamed loudly. The man ordered to find out everything that happened in the village regarding the child named Dan Ak's son. The faction leader screamed and complained about how hot it was for him. The man did not stop this torture and shouted to the people that they only had an hour, and so one of them hurried to the village as fast as he could in order to at least find out something and not die. He burst into the room shouting that his people had managed to find the child. The leader looked at him but did not answer. He only tapped his finger on the table. He was informed that the man had set off on a horse and would probably be with them soon. The leader clicked his tongue in displeasure. He couldn't understand what was so special about some little brat. Suddenly there was a roar and it became clear who had arrived. The doors slowly opened and a bright red robe appeared from behind them. Seeing the man in the doorway, the leader immediately understood how murderous his intention was. One of the leader's men approached the man and asked who he was and where Mr. Pang was. As soon as they tried to touch this man, he suddenly put his hand in front of him and pointed his index finger. The man immediately fell to the floor. The leader was very scared. The guest was too strong for a simple mercenary. It was clear that it was impossible to argue with this in the guests, and apparently it was also impossible to defend oneself from it. With just one index finger, he was able to kill one of the guards without even trying. It was a great bloody fist. He smiled, noting that they wanted to catch him so much that they immediately recognized him when he entered. The leader shouted that Cho Ak Ryan had arrived and ordered the entire squad to gather. He himself drew his sword and prepared to defend himself. Following Ak Ryan, Bomb KV came out, dragging another of the guards along with him, who was mumbling something with difficulty. Bomb KV held two of the leader's men who begged him to save them. Bomb KV was also recognized. The second name was the Great Master of the Mountains. Bomb KV looked at Dan Ak, who was lying unconscious on the bed. He was completely dissatisfied with the boy's appearance and hissed whether this was Quack's doing. Quack only thought about how strong the Master of the Mountains was and was afraid that he would not be able to cope with such an opponent. Quack growled in anger and confusion. He wished death on his guests and ran straight towards them. He apparently had no idea who he was dealing with, although he should have thought about it. Bomb KAW didn't need much strength to deal with such a person. In an instant, all the windows of the tavern were blown out by a powerful explosion. Flames began to burst out. The entire tavern was ablaze. A large crowd had gathered around it. These were both patrons of the tavern itself and onlookers from the street. The young man who reported Ak Ryan's arrival looked out from behind one of the houses and looked around, trying to understand the situation. He was surprised that only ordinary people ran out of the house, but not a single warrior from the evil extermination squad. He assumed that they could all die. He tried to figure out what he should do. Given the tragedy, the reaction of the Martial Arts Alliance was unexpected, but he had to report everything. Otherwise, his life would be taken. But he couldn't move because he was ordered to wait. When he turned around, he saw Bomb KW with sparkling bright eyes. The owner of the mountains was very surprised that the young man did not run away, to to which he mumbled that he promised to stay put. Ryan appeared from the other side, carrying Dan aka on his back, and noted how brave the man was to dare to stay and not run away. The man was thrown to the floor and warned to keep quiet, and if Dr. Dan was harmed in any way, then all responsibility would be placed on him and he would have to answer. Bamkewi explained to the man that if the doctor was hungry, he would feed him, and if the doctor was sad, he would also make him happy. Bamkewi continued to talk about all the responsibilities that would fall on the shoulders of this man, but Mr. Cho hurried him because they should behave more quietly and get home faster. Finally, Bamkewi asked the man to remember that from now on, everything rested on his shoulders. The man was shaking. He still couldn't figure out whether he should forget about this situation or still protect the boy. The masters carried the doctor home and put him to bed. The young man slept until dawn. When he woke up, he couldn't understand how he ended up in his own bed at home. Bamkewi explained that he and Mr. Cho carried him and laid him down. Afterwards, Mr. Cho asked how the boy was feeling and if he was in any pain. Danak replied that he was fine, but couldn't understand how they brought him home if they weren't allowed to go out in public places because of the martial arts alliance, which definitely wouldn't let them go just like that. Mr. Cho smiled and explained to the boy that they had resolved everything like adults by simply talking and nothing terrible had happened. Danak looked at the masters and said that she didn't believe them at all. Sol Hua entered the room and intervened in the conversation, saying that she personally spoke with the alliance. She noted that unlike those two, she was not a cruel martial artist like the 10 great villains. The boy smiled quickly, realizing that the girl was the patient the masters had spoken of, and introduced himself. The witch gave her name and asked to be called simply Auntie. The boy jumped out of bed and started talking about the sound that echoed in his head, and that his parents told him about it. He happily exclaimed that it was a technique that martial artists used for secret negotiations. That meant the girl was a strong master. Bamkewi, a little jealous of the boy towards the witch, snorted, considering that there was nothing special in this transmission of sound. Mr. Cho noted that if he were completely cured, he would also use such a technique. Danak turned to his aunt and, telling her that he had had some difficulties yesterday, asked if she would mind if he quickly washed up and prepared to check her condition. The girl agreed without any problems, and the doctor promised that he would return immediately. Ryan emphasized that the boy was very strong in spirit, and Bamkewi agreed with him, also noting that it was too hard for the child's body. Sol Hua was surprised that this child actually inherited the healing techniques of the divine and demonic healers. She looked at the masters and thought that since these monsters were so obedient, it meant that everything was not so simple. The girl turned to the men and told them to build a new house for her since they had nothing to do. Bamkewi was indignant and asked if she was completely out of her mind at that age. The girl looked at him and asked if it was necessary to tell anyone about what Tanya had done last night, that everything was soaked with the smell of blood. Mr. Cho immediately pushed the owner of the holes to leave the room in order to immediately get to work. Despite the fact that the girl wanted a new home for herself, she decided to clean the doctor's house as well. She hated it when the house was dirty. Soon the doctor returned and began to examine the girl. He didn't just feel her pulse, he felt her condition completely. The doctor was very surprised and noted that he himself could not believe it. He explained that the girl not only did not want to talk, she really could not do it. The doctor said that the treatment would take more than 1 day, if it could be called that. The boy was confused and warned that he could not guarantee any results since he was seeing such symptoms for the first time. The girl thought that if there were divine and demonic healers in front of her, they would say the same thing. She simply shouldn't hope for anything. The doctor then said that although this was not comforting, all he could do was to partially restore the girl's voice, which greatly shocked her. She was amazed that she had at least some chance to speak. The doctor explained that he could not cure everything at once, but little by little it would be possible to restore her health. And of course, it was not a complete cure. He explained that it was necessary to stop the flow of cold energy coming from her meridians. Then he would be able to stimulate her nerves and muscles to increase their activity. The girl was surprised that this was possible when she asked about it. The doctor simply ignored her question and suggested that she start the procedures immediately. He took out his set and began to place them in specific places on the witch's body. A little while later, the doctor noted that the progress was good and they were already finished with acupuncture. He asked the witch to pronounce the letter A and explained that she should imagine that she was slowly taking a deep breath and then inhaling. The girl tried to pronounce this letter, but then noted that it sounded like scraping metal. Well, the boy praised her and asked her to continue in the same spirit. The girl obediently began to try again and again to utter at least the slightest sound. Soon, a miracle happened. The woman who had been unable to speak for years was able to pronounce the sound of the letter A. Hearing that she had succeeded, she began to repeat it over and over again. The boy's eyes lit up. He was glad that the changes were already visible. The girl turned to the doctor and asked if she had said that, and realized that she was not transmitting information, but speaking out loud. The boy smiled and noted that she could speak. The girl continued to repeat the sounds. She thought about how long she had not heard her voice, and was so amazed by such a phenomenon. The doctor asked the witch to lie down, explaining that he needed to examine her more closely. He carefully placed the witch's hand in the correct position and asked her to relax. He asked her not to open her mouth or move, even if she felt something strange, and explained that Mr. Baum and Mr. Cho did not feel anything, but some might have been ticklish. The girl did everything as her doctor asked and thought that the child in front of her really did possess incredible knowledge and skills. Until then, she knew no one who could help her, and could never have imagined that just a child could give her a chance for a cure. The doctor carefully monitored the girl's heartbeat and applied skills that were supposed to help her. The boy was extremely focused. He had no martial arts skills. Who knew about training the spirit to achieve non-existence? The witch stood up and asked how he learned it, noting that he had no martial arts. The doctor explained that if you trace the history of the development of medical skills, you can see that they were connected with martial arts. He said that in the world of martial arts, there were several methods of improving internal energy and an infinite number of techniques for training it, but the basic principles in the world of martial arts and in the world of medicine were similar. He went on to say that Taoism had many branches, but the main philosophy that ran through them all was one. It was immortality and ascension to immortality. He said that most of the currently existing Taoist sects belong to the direction of improving smoke. Their followers created elixirs using alchemy, but it seemed to him that the girl began to train the spirit to achieve non-existence a very long time ago. The healer said that the witch's problem was that her spirit was unstable. It looked like she was about to move on to the next stage of training, having not yet completed the previous one. He stressed that she had lost the ability to express emotions and taste because her muscles and nerves were frozen in time. The witch stood up and asked if the healer could fix it, and he replied that he would need to study some things, but he thought that healing would be possible, but it would take time. Then the doctor added that something was bothering him, but he didn't know how to say it. The girl asked him to say it as it was because she was ready for anything. He said that after the treatment, aging will resume because the flow of time of her body will be restored. The girl replied that she wanted this too. She wanted to start growing old like everyone else. The doctor was surprised, sharing that he thought women wanted to preserve their beauty as long as possible, and even his mother wanted the same. The witch replied that if the healer could free her from this endless circle of hell, she would be grateful to him for the rest of her life. The boy was embarrassed and replied that it was not necessary. He was just doing what he had to. He gave the example that the girl agreed to help with the cleaning, and in any case he should also be grateful to her for this. After some time, Danak went to the village again to do his usual shopping. Seol Hua went with him. In response to his gratitude for her agreement to accompany him, the girl noted that she had nothing to do anyway. Dr. Dan thought about how the craftsmen worked very hard to build the house. It seemed to him that they began to avoid him to convince himself that the problem was in his imagination. When they walked down the street together with the witch, the girl attracted the attention of all the men. They praised her beautiful appearance, showered her with compliments, and could not take their eyes off her. They dropped everything they were doing and followed the woman with their eyes, being completely enchanted by her. The doctor was surprised that there was a large crowd of people around them, but thanks to Sol Hui, they still walked very freely. Suddenly, a young man appeared in front of them and ran straight towards them. The guy knelt down on one knee in front of the doctor, for which everyone present considered him very brave. The young man handed the doctor some kind of package. The boy was surprised, not believing that the package was addressed specifically to him. The young man unwrapped the package. It turned out to be shashlik with vegetables and said that he wanted to start his duties from today. The doctor was surprised and asked why he needed it. The young man asked him to take it and visit them at the tavern more often, although the boy did not understand at all what was happening and why he needed so much food. The young man handed the bundle to the doctor and hurried away, telling him to eat his fill. The boy was completely confused. He didn't understand where this young man came from and why he gave him so much food. Sol Hua looked around a lot. Studying everything will help to become useful. Her gaze fell on a wicker basket standing on the threshold of one of the houses. But in fact, it was not the baskets or the house itself that attracted her attention, but the man who was hiding behind it. Overall, the doctor really liked this gift, although he felt rather awkward accepting it. He said that apparently a lot of new establishments opened that day, and another young man came up and offered to try his food and told me that he had just opened a new lollipop shop. The doctor thanked him and promised that next time, they would definitely pay for these sticks, and asked about the location of the store. The man hesitated a little, not knowing what to answer or how to get off topic. He just ran away, bon appetit. Solhua concluded that the locals were very friendly to the doctor, judging by the way they greeted him. They continued to be followed. The young man hid in the alleys and followed closely behind the doctor and the witch. This man turned to his friend and asked if everything had been delivered as it should have been. The man replied that he had asked the children to give the doctor the best of everything. The young man could hear Mr. Bohm's words about the enormous responsibility that now lay on his shoulders. He couldn't understand how he could have gotten into such a situation. The doctor went to the herbal shop, and the seller, as usual, greeted him with joy. The gentleman began by saying that the head of the hospital, Jin Sun, had conveyed something to the boy and asked him to convey that he should not have appeared in the village until everything had calmed down. The gentleman said that last night there was a fire in the Blue Flower Inn where the Alliance of Martial Artists was staying. It was a shock for the doctor. The master spoke of a great commotion. No one could have imagined that the great evil extermination squad of the Martial Arts Alliance would disappear in the Devil's Fire. The gentleman relayed rumors that several jugs of wine were found at the site of the fire and suggested that the craftsmen were apparently so drunk that they were unable to escape. The seller said that fortunately they were the only ones living in that tavern. Otherwise, the tragedy would have been much larger, because even the head of the hospital could have been in danger if he had not been late for the meeting. The gentleman explained that Master Pong had settled everything and conveyed that he would come to the doctor personally, since the situation in the village was not the calmest after yesterday's events and it was better to wait it out in the valley. The young man was shocked by what he heard. He said that he remembered everything, up until the moment he fainted, and was completely unaware of any fire. He couldn't understand how he ended up in the valley of the divine and demonic healers. The boy was grateful to the seller of medicinal herbs that he now knew everything, because the masters who lived in his house only changed the subject. The seller approached the doctor with some concerns. He let it be known that Wang had brought that same 200-year-old wild ginseng. Hearing this, the doctor was very happy and said that he would take it immediately. The boy was incredibly happy with this news, not taking into account the news about the fire. He was glad that he was able to get hold of such herbs, thanks to which he could heal his guest. The witch said that the doctor was rather arrogant, and she did not think that he would spend all 10,000 silver just on ginseng. Here the doctor came to his senses. He needed to buy a lot more. He was so happy about the ginseng that he forgot about everything else and now didn't know what to do. Solhua remembered a saying. They said that those who knew true wisdom sometimes seemed like fools, and the same was true for the doctor. The girl paid attention to the amount of food that was given to the doctor and noted that at least he would eat his fill. The boy confirmed that this was a real stroke of luck. The waterfall, as always, made a loud noise and foamed as it flowed into the river. Right under the stream stood Ryan and thought about what trouble the healer Dan had gotten into. He smoked himself for dragging the boy into trouble with the Alliance of Martial Arts Masters. In a cruel world, those who were all alone needed to be able to defend themselves. The gentleman decided to teach the Dr. Dan martial arts so that he could stand up for himself if necessary. Dr. Dan was busy with his household chores. He put the kettle on the coals and waited for everything to be ready. He sat nearby and used a fan to keep the coals warm. He was called again and he hastened with displeasure to find out what was going on. Outside, the masters argued again. Sol Hua called the doctor. Bom KV scolded Akryang for wanting to make a disabled boy, and he denied everything. Sol Hua explained that the masters could not decide which of them would teach the doctor martial arts, and noted that they were hopeless. The doctor had no idea that he was about to learn this. Mr. Cho asked the boy who he wanted to choose as his teacher. The boy came up to them and said that he had heard that talent was very important in martial arts, and that they also said that one should learn martial arts from childhood. Bom K-wee confirmed that they usually started around age 7, but it was never too late. Mr. Cho suggested checking the boy's physical fitness first and asked him to come over to take a closer look. Mr. Cho felt the boy over from all sides, studying his muscles and his overall physical condition. He touched his wrist and warned him that he would send true energy into him, and asked him not to be afraid. The gentleman concentrated, and the doctor at least felt some new sensations in his body. At that moment, Mr. Cho became a little upset and replied that it was probably too late to learn, and would explain that it would not be easy for the boys to learn high-level martial arts. Bam Wee was very surprised that Dr. Dan had no talent, but Mr. Cho assured him that he really did not have any. Ak Ryan tried to calm the boy down, noting that even an ant was small but could dig mountains. He explained that although the doctor was a casual martial artist, this could be achieved through his own efforts. The gentleman said that he had no talent either, but he had put in a lot of effort and had become the greatest master in the world. He said that if the boy studied with him, he would be able to achieve a lot. The gentleman said that one day Dan Ak might surpass him and become the next greatest master. Sol Hua intervened in this conversation and noted that this was all rather dubious. The girl noted that Ak Ryan talked too much and sounded too desperate. The girl took the boy's hand in hers and decided to try to do everything herself. The masters watched what was happening in bewilderment. Suddenly, the girl's eyes were pierced by something like a spark. She hugged him tightly, almost grabbed the boy, and screamed that this child was hers. Ak Ryan reminded that the girl did not want to participate in everything, but she interrupted him and replied that she had changed her mind and could not give them such talent. Bam KV, hearing the witch's words, attacked Ak Ryan again and began to swear that he lied again. In fact, the healer had talent. Mr. Cho decided not to entertain this dispute and suggested that they let Dr. Dan decide which of the three he would choose as his teacher. Bam Wee really wanted to become the boy's mentor and tried to knock the others out of this game. Sol Hua, hugging the boy by the shoulders, emphasized that giving a child with such talent to masters is simply irresponsible. Her conscience as a martial arts master simply will not allow this to be done. Bam KV became even more indignant, and the girl, looking at him menacingly, offered to take the boy away from her. Bam Wee very quickly agreed to the fight and suggested that the winner would become the teacher of Dr. Dan. Mr. Cho suggested simply comparing their techniques, but he was quickly shut up, pointing out that liars have no right to speak. The boy was surprised that he had a talent for martial arts and asked if it was true. Ak Ryan explained that his physique was very rare, but even the most talented masters could not compare to him. Sol Hua noted his anterior median and posterior median meridians, and that his mysterious path of life and death was already open, and the 8 marvelous and 12 main meridians were also well developed. The boy replied that in some way he already knew about this, since his mother, when she was pregnant, took various elixirs on purpose. Immediately after birth, he underwent a purification ritual. As a child, he drank even more elixirs. His parents often used acupuncture to maintain his health. The construction workers looked at the boy and thought the same thing. Olya Kolya was a great talent as a martial artist, as expected. Dan Ak asked if he really had to choose only one master, to which Mr. Cho replied that since all the techniques were unique, he would have to choose. The boy concentrated and thought for a while, going through every available option. After a short time, Dan informed that he had made a decision and did not want any of the masters as his teacher. The masters were very surprised and began to ask why the boy chose this particular solution. He explained that if he becomes a student by choosing one of them, then both will be offended, but he doesn't want that. And it will be better for him if everything remains as it is. When the doctor left to do his own thing, the masters stayed and continued talking. They were very sorry that the doctor had made such a decision. Mr. Cho noted that at this rate, Dr. Den would simply waste his talent and asked the others if they could somehow convince the guy. Sol Hua asked if it was necessary for the boy to become someone's student and emphasized that she wanted to teach him just like that. Ak Ryan didn't like this at all, and he asked if the girl had gone crazy and decided to pass on her martial arts, even if the guy wasn't her direct student. The girl noted that it was up to her to decide who to pass on her techniques to. Bam Kewe agreed with her and noted that the healer did not have to choose one teacher for himself. Ak Ryan shamed him for saying such things in front of his master, but Mr. Baum asked why he should be ashamed if his master only wanted one thing, that he mastered martial arts perfectly and that the healer should be trained as well. Sol Hua noted that Mr. Cho himself called the boy his benefactor, and some martial arts could not compare with that. But Ak Ryan continued to freak out. The girl asked him who saved his life, and he thought for a long time. But he still said that it was impossible to do so, and it was necessary to choose only one teacher. This dispute continued for a very long time. Soon it was almost lunchtime, and everyone sat down at the table. The doctor who prepared the food asked the masters to chew all the herbs very thoroughly. The masters did what their doctor asked without question, without asking why and without arguing in any way. Mr. Cho ate the food that Dan Ak cooked with great pleasure and openly showed the pleasure he received. Dr. Dan approached the gentleman and began to feel him. The young man began to scold the master for being too zealous, but his internal energy had not yet been restored. The boy began to say that the master could only independently control his energy, but could not yet use it to its full potential. And at that moment, Ak Ryan took him by the cheeks. Bum Wee and Sol Hua jumped up from the table with very surprised faces. Mr. Cho laughed and noted that he had to apologize to them. The boy did not understand what was happening. Mr. Cho explained that yesterday, he had given his original infinite energy to Dr. Dan, as expected. The boy had accepted it differently. Now Dr. Dan simply needed to continue learning his martial art. The other masters were taken aback by this action and did not know what to answer. At that moment, Mr. Cho himself was a little worried. Ak Ryan turned to the healer and asked if other masters had come to him yesterday evening. Dan Ak replied that first his aunt came to him, then Mr. Cho, and then Mr. Baum. Ak Ryan got furious and began to loudly curse at those who accused him of being able to kill the boy because the chi energy could have been disrupted. The doctor intervened and asked them not to quarrel, noting that while he did not have enough internal energy, nothing terrible could happen, but now he could better assess their physical condition, which would help with the treatment. Mr. Cho asked the boy to simply not use these techniques at the same time, or his meridians would become intertwined. Dan assured him that there was no need to worry and that he would not do anything harmful to his body. At that moment, the boy suggested that they all study martial arts together, which somewhat confused the masters. The doctor confirmed that he would like this and explained that the ant had excessive yin energy and Mr. Baum had yang, and because of this, the harmony of yin and yang was disrupted. With Mr. Cho, it was completely different because his energy was concentrated right in the center. The doctor suggested that if they studied these martial arts together, it would not only help their healing, but also contribute to the development of martial arts. The boy said that his mom and dad did the same. They studied each other's techniques, did not try to exchange healing skills, and their paths were too different. But one day they had an incurable patient. Neither divine nor demonic doctors could cure him. Not only did this man have an advanced chronic disease, he was also poisoned. When his parents tried their best to rid him of the poison, their chi energy was disrupted. It was very difficult for them, but they managed to save the man, and then the divine and demonic healers treated the patient together for the first time. The boy shared that his parents often argued, but also shared experiences during treatment, and then the patient recovered and returned home. Mr. Baum thought that all this was against the rules, but the martial arts of his acquaintances were useful. Mr. Cho thought about the same thing. Bum Wee said that overall there was no difference, and since Dr. Den says so, they should do it that way. Sol Hua agreed with him, noting that if it helps, she agrees to everything. The doctor was delighted and officially stated that they would then study martial arts together and received a question from Mr. Cho whether he wanted to eventually learn the best technique. The doctor smiled broadly and replied that he would learn the technique that they would study together. Mr. Cho smiled and asked the boy if he wanted to create a new kind of martial arts. The doctor replied that with the level of martial arts mastery of all the masters, it was quite possible and would definitely be useful in treatment. Mr. Baum asked what the boy would do if nothing worked out, and he replied that he would simply stop practicing martial arts, and this did not upset him at all. He went to take the dishes and left all the masters alone. They were completely confused because they did not expect that the boy would make such a decision himself. Ak Ryan said that the original was infinite, noting the guy's abilities. Then the gentleman said that without established rules, they had no restrictions and thought about it. He went on to say that without the rise of the fallout, there was no progress, and that was where the strength lay. Mr. Cho recited a mantra to awaken internal energy. Ak Ryan stated that if they decided to do this, they should do everything as it should be. For the sake of this child, they should try. He drew everyone's attention to the boy and emphasized that he had tried his best for them so far and that he personally could not lose the boy's trust. Bum Wee agreed with him and said that he wanted to pass on his martial arts only to the Dr. Dan and no one else. The witch joined him and said that she also did not want to disappoint the boy. Now these three were for one goal. They had to work harmoniously and quarrel and argue with each other as little as possible. Meanwhile, a man came out not far from the doctor's yard. "Come out of the bushes." He exhaled heavily and noted that it was still very dangerous to walk in these parts. He walked forward with pleasure and looked around, rejoicing at what he saw, because he had not been in these places for a very long time. For him, this place held a lot of memories, and it seemed that he was about to hear the screams of his masters. Suddenly a thug jumped out in front of him and warned him that it was better not to move. It was Mr. Baum. The man did not expect such a meeting and began to ask who was in front of him. Mr. Baum replied that he was the one who should ask such questions of uninvited guests. Mr. Baum asked him to give his name and threatened to cut off his head otherwise. Mr. Pang became a little tense, but still asked him to tell the young lord of the valley about his arrival. Baum Kawi was surprised that this man knew about the doctor and asked her if he was the Alliance's messenger. Mr. Pang explained that he had known the boy for many years and had nothing to do with hookah. Ak Ryan appeared behind Mr. Pang and warned that if the doctor said that he didn't know this, then he wouldn't leave the valley alive. Mr. Pang, not wanting to get involved in any conflicts, asked if they could simply inform Dr. Dan of his arrival. A boy's voice was heard shouting that he knew this man. Bam Kwi immediately calmed down and became softer. Mr. Pang asked the young lord how he was doing and, smiling, emphasized that now he needed to be called Lord, since the boy had grown up and was no longer a child. Sol Hua turned to the boy and asked if he knew this man for sure. The doctor replied that this man was a student of his parents and was a good person. He should not be drilled with a frightening look. The boy turned to Mr. Pangu and asked what brought him to the valley. The boy did not expect him to come without warning, and now he knew that all the masters were here. Mr. Pang smiled and noted that of course he knew that the young lord had comrades, but he definitely didn't expect to see this. Still, the masters took Mr. Pang to the doctor. The boy noted that the gentleman was most likely very surprised by such a meeting and explained that these were his patients who were staying with him during the treatment. Mr. Pang said he now understood why the boy had been avoiding him. He noted that he understood that the boy had wanted to become independent, but had apparently gone too far. The doctor apologized and noted that Mr. Pang was simply very unpleasant to him. The master ignored this and asked if his guests were the Bloody Fist and the Mad Master of the Mountains. He understood from the boy's expression that he was right. The gentleman understood where these people had been hiding from him all this time. The doctor did not understand how the gentleman could have found out about this. The gentleman explained that rumors about the Great Bloody Fist had spread throughout the village. In addition, the doctor himself began to buy other medicinal herbs that were used for seriously ill patients. The boy explained that these people were seriously injured, and if he had not come to their aid, they would have died. The gentleman emphasized that he was not saying that saving people was bad, but on the contrary, he was impressed by the abilities of the young lord of the valley. Mr. Pang asked the boy to let him help him. He noted that he now knew his secret, and could the boy really drive him away? The doctor replied that he did not want to expose the master to danger. The gentleman replied that he understood what the young lord was afraid of, and therefore took some measures before coming to visit. The gentleman assumed that the young man was probably expecting him to go to the meeting with the Alliance because of the incident with the Hall Destruction Squad. He said that he vouched for the healer and everyone had to believe him. Dr. Dan asked the gentleman how he could be connected to the Alliance of Martial Artists. The gentleman explained that the members of the Alliance were the most important clients of his hospital, and that the youngest daughter of the head of the Alliance was currently being treated by him. It was very surprising to hear. The masters eavesdropped on the entire conversation behind the door and were sentenced thanks to the transmission of information. Bam Kawi shared that he knew that the man was somehow connected with the Alliance, and Sol Hua emphasized that apparently he really was familiar with the Alliance. Mr. Cho thought that the hospital had recently become very famous, and apparently the two masters were completely unaware of it. Mr. Pang told the young man that if he does not support the Alliance, then he will go against him, and they will be in the same boat. The young man asked why the gentleman is doing all this. The man smiled and asked who could leave his family in trouble. He specified that if he was asked to leave, it would be tantamount to certain death. The doctor promised that he would not benefit anyone, and apologized again, noting that it was probably because of him that they had to go through a lot. The gentleman smiled and noted that if the boys suddenly needed medicinal herbs, he could safely come to him. This offer made the young man very happy, and he immediately asked to bring him the essence of the Azure Stone. It was the Earth's energy embodied in liquid, and the price of this unique elixir was incredibly high. The gentleman, having heard what the boy was demanding of him, was very surprised and at first thought that it was some kind of joke. Looking at the boy, I realized that he was not joking at all and was really hoping for such help. But at that moment, the masters behind the door decided to disperse. Mr. Cho replied that they would soon see this essence, but it was not intended for him. Sol Hua noted that it was absurd, like asking for wild ginseng in exchange for bellflower root. The healing procedures continued regularly. The doctor tried his best to get all the masters back on their feet. Bom Ka Wee's procedure was completed, and he rose to his feet and sincerely thanked his doctor. The doctor asked the gentleman not to forget to take his medicine before going to bed, who replied that he was not a child and asked him not to worry. When the master went out into the corridor, he met Mr. Pang again. The gentleman noted that in previous meetings he had not been able to introduce himself properly, and having given his name, explained that he was in charge of a small hospital. The master did not understand what this man was getting at. He noted that he understood that he and the Dr. Dan were close people, but still the gentleman should behave carefully. The master warned the gentleman not to even think about taking advantage of this naive and innocent child. The gentleman was very surprised by such a warning and assured that he had not even thought about it. The master decided that a simple warning was not enough and created a real threat, promising that the master would have a very hard time if the child was harmed. The master snorted angrily and walked away. Mr. Pang also distrusted Master Bom as much as he did him. He believed that patients were patients, and you can't choose who to treat based on their beliefs, but this master was definitely one of the 10 great villains. The doctor, leaving his office, met the gentleman again and invited him to go to bed, since it was already late. And what did he answer here? He had a question. The gentleman said that as far as he understood, the boy had previously restored the damaged meridians of martial arts masters and asked if he had any notes left. The healer replied that there were records, but it was not so easy to see them, since there were no records on paper specifically, since at that moment the masters were focused only on healing. The doctor smiled and shared that he remembered absolutely everything that was required for healing and asked who needed to be healed. Mr. Pang answered without hiding that it was necessary to cure the youngest daughter of the head of the Alliance of Martial Arts Masters. He then went on to tell a few details that needed to be known. For 15 years, this girl's meridians were damaged. Dr. Dan knew that if a child had 9 damaged yin energy meridians, many of them died in the womb or did not live to be 1 year old. Most likely, the girl had 5 or 7 damaged meridians. The gentleman shared that the problem was that the treatment was done at a distance, and they were hardly supporting her life by stuffing her with all sorts of elixirs. The doctor replied that the damaged meridians were not the cause of her illness, but the consequences, the symptoms of another disease. The boy explained that this was precisely why other doctors could not restore damaged meridians, and it was worth focusing on the source of the disease in order to choose the right treatment. The gentleman grabbed his head and replied that he had encountered something like this for the first time, so he trusted ancient medical books and eventually relaxed and lost his vigilance. The boy asked not to blame himself because even his parents did not immediately come to this conclusion. The young man asked if the gentleman remembered how it was, and he said about one patient whose parents could not heal him and were ready to give up. The gentleman remembered that monk who, in addition to his chronic illness, subsequently had his chi energy disrupted in an attempt to repel the effects of the poison. The doctor noted that his symptoms were very similar to those of the gentleman's patient. His parents then united for the first time to save a person and understood how to restore damaged meridians. The gentleman was surprised and wondered why the parents of the Dr. Dan did not teach him this technique. The boy answered that he was not taught either, but he observed a lot and remembered it. The gentleman said that he was very sorry that he was not there then. Nasha smiled and said that there was nothing terrible about it, because damaged meridians were a very rare case. At that moment, it dawned on the gentleman that this technique was known only to the Lord of the Valley. It was not known whether there was a healer like him in the world. The gentleman was glad out loud that he had arrived on time and noted that it seemed he had not noticed the obvious all this time. The sun had not yet risen above the horizon when the doctor was already waking everyone up. He burst into the room and shouted loudly for the masters to wake up. These climbs were very difficult for the masters, despite their strength. The doctor was excited. He jumped up and down and shouted something about the cause and symptoms and what was trapped. Mr. Baum was surprised and asked if that Pang had really thought of doing such a thing. The gentleman did not understand what the doctor was talking about and asked what kind of trap he meant by the mantra. The young man explained that everyone had their own physiology as well as their own meridian energy. The main meridians were similar for everyone, but the location of the additional meridians was slightly different. The style of mastering the internal energy differed from the style of the creator of this energy, and for the direction of the true energy according to the mantra, harmony was violated, which is why theoretical knowledge differed from the real situation. The doctor explained that the stronger the true energy, the more differences and possible side effects. Mr. Baum wondered why only he had side effects, but his master did not. The doctor suggested that perhaps his master had not reached the level that Mr. Baum was thinking about. The boy said that the aunt's additional meridians were concentrated in her hands, and Mr. Baum's meridians were in her back, and as a result, the true energy that was supposed to return to the Dantian through the main meridian went astray, dissipated, and ended up where it shouldn't. At this point, Mr. Pang joined them. The doctor immediately said that he had made the same mistake he had spoken about. He should have found the source of the disease and then prescribed the correct treatment, but he had only paid attention to the symptoms. The doctor explained that the real reason was the mantra of spiritual perfection that was not combined with additional meridians. Mr. Cho smiled and emphasized that now everything matched. The sources of these techniques of awakening internal energy are so ancient that it was impossible to remember when you were born. Those who were given martial arts continued to change, but the mantra itself remained the same, which is why many problems arose. Mr. Cho said that his master's technique for awakening internal energy was close to the original, but his original infinite true energy was born later, and after studying countless techniques and learning them through trial and error, the master realized that in this case there were fewer side effects. This is why the masters began to quarrel again, but Sol Hua thought and asked that if she found out the reason, then healing would become possible. The doctor replied that he had found out the source of the disease and now understood how to treat it. But there was still a small hitch. The doctor, with a very dissatisfied face, replied that this would require a lot of elixirs, much more than they were using now. Mr. Baum was very surprised and asked again whether the doctor was absolutely sure that he would need a lot of elixirs. He explained that they needed to conduct the true energy to the correct meridians, but they couldn't get to them because they hadn't been used for a long time. In addition, the body had already adapted to this method of spiritual improvement. Therefore, to free the blocked meridians, many elixirs will be needed. Mr. Pang, listening to this, came up with something. He turned to the healer and noted that the Alliance of Combat Masters had more than enough elixirs. He explained that the head of the Alliance had been collecting healing supplies for his youngest daughter throughout the Central Plain, and that the boy could also receive them since he was treating the patient himself. The gentleman explained that at this rate the girl would die, and even those elixirs that somehow supported life had already stopped working. Mr. Baum intervened in their conversation, not liking the idea that the healer was going to treat the daughter of the leader of the Alliance, reminding him of how the evil destruction squad had treated him. The doctor looked at the master and asked how he knew about this, since no one had personally told him about it. The master realized that he had miscalculated a little and began to invent a story that he had met a hunter from the village, and he said that some kind of disorder was happening in the village, where Measles did not suspect anything and answered that everything was so. All the masters together breathed a sigh of relief that the fictitious story worked. Mr. Cho thought that the daughter of the Alliance leader would not go to such a remote place all alone. There should have been a lot of escorts and warriors with her. He asked, meaning the summer that the doctor needed to go to the patient. Dr. Dan replied that he could not leave the valley because he and his aunt needed to continue their treatment. Mr. Pang said that he had a proposal. He suggested that the masters could set out on their journey with the doctor. Mr. Baum accepted this rather hostile proposal and began to ask Mr. Pang who he was, that he decided to tell someone how to live. Mr. Pang replied that if Dr. Dan does not help the daughter of the Alliance, she will die. But if he saves her, it will help them all. Akrian agreed with this, but pointed out that he was not sure that he would be able to hold on when they saw the head of the Alliance. What to say about Mr. Baum? Mr. Pang smiled and expressed his hopes that the masters would agree to this path for the sake of Dr. Dan. The master explained that the head of the Alliance of Martial Artists was the only one who could grant pardon if something went wrong. Only with them, the Lord of the Valley would be safe. Mr. Cho asked if he meant their business with the Alliance. Bam Kwi agreed that even if something happened and they were discovered, Dr. Den would be able to escape thanks to their presence. Mr. Cho thought about his words and decided that in that case they should all set out on their journey together. Sol Hua hugged the boy and replied that she didn't mind. Mr. Pang thanked everyone and offered to prepare everything for the trip. But Mr. Cho asked him to wait and combine business with pleasure. Mr. Cho suggested that the boy go on a hike, which sounded completely different. The doctor was very happy and said that he had never been on a hike before, and if they went together, he would only be glad. Bam KV, hearing that they would have to pitch tents outside for the night, became even happier and replied that he would really like to go. Mr. Cho stated that since the young man wanted to go on a hike, they could not refuse him. The village was very crowded. The shop owner was about to close the store when suddenly business started to improve. And all thanks to the wooden statues that the doctor brought. Seeing the boy on his doorstep again, the merchant was very happy to see him. The young man smiled and noted that there were a lot of foresters around. The merchant replied that if the boy could bring even more statues, he would be very grateful. There were very few figurines and many more people willing to buy them. When Bam Kaewi rolled the cart with the statues to the doors of the shop, the merchant froze in place, trying to imagine how many figurines could fit there. The young man replied that these figures should be quite enough, and warned that for some time he would not be able to come to the shop, as he was going on a hike. The merchant was very surprised and asked where exactly the expedition was headed. The doctor said that he was going to Wuhan in Hubei province, and he did not know how long it would take. The merchant was a little upset and asked the young man to be sure to come see him as soon as he returned, to which he asked him not to worry and promised to come. The merchant came out to see the boy off and waved goodbye with a little sadness. Dr. Dan waved back and wished the old man a good day. Bam KV noted how pleased the boy was. The doctor explained that the merchant had raised the price and now they had more money for the trip and could call themselves rich. Bam KV replied that since his doctor was happy, then he was happy too and flew up into the sky. Preparations for the expedition were in full swing. The first thing the masters had to do was prepare and do everything possible to avoid being recognized. Bam KV tried on the wig and was apparently very pleased with the result. Dr. Dan also approved of this image, which made the master happy. The master believed that this wig made him look 10 years younger, and the boy confirmed this. Bam KV saw a witch next to him and was surprised that she was already on this side. He asked what she was doing there, since she hadn't even disguised herself in any way. She replied that she didn't need to do that, since she hadn't done anything shameful, unlike some. The last one was Mr. Cho, and the doctor needed to evaluate his new image. The boy did not recognize the man at all and asked him directly who he was. Ak Ryan showed his real face with his hands. The transformation was the best. These changes delighted the boy. Ak Ryan took off his mask and, smiling, handed it to the doctor so that he could take a better look at it. Bam KAV even got a little worried because the mask was made of real human skin, and he wondered when he managed to make one, to which the gentleman said that he took this mask from a ghostly demon. Bam KW realized that they were probably talking about a genius of disguise, and noted that they had not heard anything about him for a long time, and perhaps he had retired. Mr. Cho replied that the genius had died about 5 years ago. Bam KV asked where he knew such information, to which Ak Ryan smiled and replied that he himself had killed him. Bam KW replied that he was now even jealous of such a mask, and now it became clear where he got it from. Mr. Cho got a little upset and asked if he really thought that this murder happened specifically because of the mask. The masters were left arguing with each other again. Sol Hua approached the boy and covered his ears so that he would listen less to such swearing. When the selection of new images was finished, everyone went out into the yard. Mr. Cho noted that from that moment on, they were employees of Jinsung's hospital. The mountain master said he had made up a name for himself and asked if it was plausible. The girl suggested simply calling themselves Villains Number 1 and Number 3, emphasizing that the mountain master was Number 3. He got furious because of this and started shouting that he deserved to be Number 1, and in real life he was Number 2, and since Brother Cho was in bad condition, his honorable place was first. Brother Zhong smiled and reminded him that out of 10 great villains, only 4 had survived, and asked if the master of the mountain still wanted to be Number 1. Mr. Baum practically shouted that he didn't care and wanted to be Number 1. The doctor, wishing to quickly resolve another dispute, suggested calling Mr. Baum the Number 1 villain, and Ak Ryan suggested calling himself the villain Gon. Sol Hua suggested that MDM be called brothers since their names were very similar, but Mr. Bum was not satisfied with this. He started to wail again. Their argument was interrupted by Mr. Pang, who informed her that he was ready to leave. The doctor said that they had not yet managed to pack their things. The master asked everyone not to hurry. Why else was it necessary to inform the Martial Arts Alliance about the arrival of a new doctor? He said that meeting the best doctor in the entire Central Plain was a real event. At this point, the boy asked to stop all the praise. The man turned to the Lord of the Valley and informed him that he was already leaving. The boy waved both hands at the man and promised to see him soon. Mr. Pang thought that everything was very strange. In the world of martial arts, patients like the boys were considered gods of death. What was strange to him was that when the masters looked at the Lord of the Valley, he did not feel any threat, and he even had doubts that they really were one of the 10 great villains. He had no choice but to trust and move on. Soon after, following Mr. Pang, the Dr. Dan and his master set out on their journey. Along the way, the young man collected various herbs. Watching the boy, Mr. Baum asked Mr. Cho if they were doing the right thing. Ak Ryan asked what Baum KV meant. He said that it took only a day to get there on the main road. At this rate, it would take them more than 5 days or even more. Ak Ryan replied that it was not so important and that this road was good in its own way, which Baum KV subsequently agreed with, looking at how pleased the Dr. Dan looked. Baum KV noted that it was so quiet and calm around him, but he was not bored at all to his great surprise. The doctor suggested that everyone eat, to which the masters unanimously agreed without any problems. The young man laid out the collected herbs and berries in front of his patients. Baum KV, going a little further into the forest, said that they were going on a hike after all, and vegetables alone would not be enough. He pointed out that since they were going on a long journey, they needed strength, and meat provided the energy. Baum KV went hunting, and Mr. Cho suggested lighting a fire and setting up a tent. Ak Ryan immediately began to make a fire and, having collected some brushwood and thick sticks, laid them out on the ground. He had a special device for starting a fire. Soon he managed to get fire and make a bonfire. But suddenly there was a strong gust of wind. Because of this strong wind, Mr. Cho's barely flaring light went out. This wind was because of Han Sol-hwa, who appeared nearby at the wrong time. The gentleman tried again, but as soon as the fire began to grow, a gust of wind extinguished it. The gentleman was already starting to get angry, and turning to his sister, he began to scold her. The witch was showing off her skills to the healer, which is why the strong wind was choking Mr. Cho's fire. The doctor was delighted. It was the first time he had seen mosquitoes caught in such an interesting way, simply by placing them in a kind of ice chamber. Ak Ryan turned to the girl and asked if she could have warned him about this in advance. Well, at that moment, Baum KV came out of the forest with the meat he had obtained. He had managed to hunt a wild boar and was glad that they would have some excellent pork for dinner. The doctor was amazed at how big the boar was. Baum KV discovered that there was still no fire and began to curse what Ak Ryan had been doing all this time. Baum KV suggested to their weak brother Cho that in that case they cook the boar, and he himself would take care of all the other chores. After some time, the fire was lit and the meat was almost ready. Everyone sat around the fire and waited for dinner to be ready. As soon as the meat was ready, everyone pounced on it, because after a long journey through the fresh air, the appetite was wild. The doctor looked somewhere to the side, noticed some kind of light, and said that apparently someone else would be spending the night with them. Mr. Cho, licking the last bone, suggested taking a walk to speed up digestion and smiled. The doctor liked this idea, and they immediately went for a walk. They reached the place from which that very light was visible. Not far from them, someone made a stop. In this temporary camp, there were a lot of armed men, who also took advantage of their free time to do their own thing or warm themselves by the fire. Ak Ryan and the healer Dan came even closer to the camp, trying to find out who these people were. The doctor asked whose flag was installed in this camp. Mr. Cho explained that it was the flag of the escorts. He said that it was installed by a special agency for transporting valuables. The doctor said that he had never seen anything like this and was very surprised. Very soon, Mr. Cho and Dr. Dan were noticed by the camp guards, who became interested in these individuals. The boys were definitely in an unfriendly mood, judging by their looks and readiness to attack. The doctor noted that these people seemed not to be happy to see them, to which the gentleman replied that during the mission they treated everyone with suspicion. He explained that secrecy directly depended on the safety of the valuables of the escorts themselves, so they were usually wary of those who revealed them. In addition, it was night, and it was not surprising that they were even more attentive. Dan Ak grabbed the gentleman by the hand and suggested that they leave there, since they were not at all welcome. But suddenly the doctor smelled some kind of smell that interested him very much. He sniffed, trying to figure out what exactly it smelled like. He recognized this smell. He shared with the master that this was the smell of the medicinal herb, 9 branches of immortality, from which a very rare elixir was obtained. One was surprised that the boy could smell this grass at such a great distance. The boy was already thinking about how to ask people to sell him that very grass. Well, I quickly remembered that it might not work, because the escort would most likely set a high price. And besides, they are prohibited from selling anything without the client's permission. The gentleman was still thinking about the boy who had managed to smell the scent at a very long distance, and he became curious whether the doctor became like this every time he saw the elixir. The gentleman's attention was drawn to 2 guys. Their faces seemed very familiar to the gentleman, and he tried to remember where he could have seen them. He raised his chin in confusion and then smiled, thinking of something. The next day they all set out, As soon as the healer was distracted by collecting more herbs, all three masters very quietly disappeared from sight. They were tracking that very escort. Bomkv looked at the guys that Akrion pointed at and confirmed that they were demon twins. It looked like these bastards lived a long time. Mr. Cho noted that the twins had been in the criminal world for many days, but still, due to the high skill of the mountain master, they would be at the bottom of the list if it were necessary to name the 100 greatest masters in the world. Mr. Baum, I will conclude that since these people were here, the 9 branches of immortality were in the boxes. Let's have the guys disguise themselves as escorts to steal the medicinal herbs. Mr. Cho said that there could be other valuables there. There was no rule for one item. Mr. Baum wanted to steal the herbs, but Sol Hua concluded that the doctor would not like it. Mr. Cho asked everyone to be quiet and pointed out that they were going in the same direction. So for now we'll have to follow them and wait for the right moment. So they did, and for a very long time they trailed behind this escort and were vigilant towards them. None of the people in the escort suspected that they were being followed. Mr. Cho and Mr. Baum walked slowly and pretended not to be interested in the carts. Mr. Baum asked the leader where the healer den was. He said that he and his sister were walking behind and collecting herbs at the same time. Baum was indignant that 3 days had already passed. Their plan was still not completed. Bomkv suggested simply killing everyone, not wanting to just sit and wait. But the question was, how would Dr. Den react to this? The doctor ran up and asked, what if these people weren't hired, but specifically escorts were hired? He assumed that these guys were the clients who found escorts and then disguised themselves to protect their goods. Bomkv got a little tense and asked the boy from what point he heard the conversation, and as it turned out, he heard everything from the very beginning. But overall, it was good that the boy put forward such an idea that could really be true. Having replied that he knew everything about their conversation since they had been walking together for several days, the doctor indicated that he had an idea. He assumed that if those guys stole the goods, they could return it to the owner, when they could possibly ask him to give them that grass as a thank you. Akrion asked what to do if they were clients who hired escorts. But it was the Dr. Dan who replied that in that case they could do nothing. It had nothing to do with them, so they would have to give up. Looking at the doctor, Mr. Cho and Mr. Baum looked at each other as if conferring. Mr. Cho turned to the doctor and told him that in fact, he was connected with these people and that Bomkv was very close to those guys. Bomkv smiled broadly and said that he was their savior and asked to leave this matter only to him. In fact, his hands just did not reach to kill them. In general, he considered it as a rescue. We had to wait until night fell and the escort set up camp. Almost everyone went to bed and were already on their 10th dream. Suddenly, the demonic twins felt a murderous intent towards them and immediately woke up. They jumped up thinking that they were being attacked or were about to be. They tried to figure out where their enemies were and scanned the camp through and through. They were addressed mentally and called skinny and short. The voice came from the forest and asked to forget about the murderous intent to go to him. The twins were alarmed that their enemies used sound transmission. They tensed up even more when they realized that only one person had addressed them in this way. When they remembered the mad master of the mountains, they immediately broke out in a cold sweat from the fear that had rolled over them. They ran towards the voice that continued to call them. They ran with all their might, almost falling, and could not believe that this was happening to them. Of all the possible people, it was the master of the mountains who found them. They were curious about what this madman was doing in this forest. We decided to first listen to what he wanted, and then sort out the whole situation and stopped as far away from Bomkv as possible. The master smiled and asked if the medicinal herb 9 branches of immortality was their product. The guys became even more tense and asked how he knew this. The eyes of the mountain master lit up as it became known that all the guesses were confirmed. He asked to give this herb to him and promised to go home peacefully. They quickly noticed the man's crazy gaze and began to carefully back away, realizing that they would not be able to defend themselves. They noted that Bomkv's appearance had changed. It was definitely him, and they could only make one mistake and die. They didn't think long and weren't even going to argue. One of them, unable to withstand the pressure, immediately agreed to give the grass to the master. This amazed his brother, and even more amazed Bomkv himself, who had hoped to have a little fun. The guy immediately ran for the goods, but the other one stayed and voluntarily agreed to have his head cut off if he didn't return. Bomkv slightly tensed up. He didn't understand why these guys gave up so quickly, and it seemed suspicious to him, and he immediately stopped the guy who went to get the goods. He told them directly that he understood that they were stirring up trouble and that something was clearly wrong, but he just couldn't figure out what exactly. The guys tried to make excuses and change the subject. Han Sol-hwa gave him information that apparently these guys must have had something much more valuable than the herb they needed. Hearing this, Mr. Baum also asked them to give him something else. The boys looked at each other and asked what exactly the owner of the mountains wanted to receive. Bam K-Vi replied that he wanted to receive what they translate in addition to the medicinal herb, and they themselves understand what he is talking about. Just as the boys wanted to object, Bam Ke-wi activated all of his power reserves and seemed to increase in size right before their eyes. The guys were shaking with fear, noting that the owner of the mountains had become much stronger and now they definitely had no chance of somehow resisting him, let alone winning. The guys promised to give everything back, and soon the chests with goods were handed over. I'm going through all the goods. Bam KV was surprised when I saw the night pearl. I gave all the goods to the guys who wanted to hurry back to the camp, but the master did not let them do this and asked where they were heading with all these goods. They looked at each other and replied that they also needed to survive somehow. Hearing that the gentleman was dissatisfied with the answer, they said that recently, the Alliance of Martial Artists declared that they would destroy 100 great villains and declared a hunt for them. The gentleman asked if they were on this list, and they replied that even before they were listed among the 100 great villains, they were already among the top 100 great martial artists and were considered to be at the top of the criminal world. Bam K-wi smiled and asked where the great masters wanted to hide from the Alliance. The boys cowered in fear but replied that they could not tell the gentleman everything. They should have regretted such words because it angered the master of the mountains. The boys were shaking, but something still continued to hold them in the same place and did not allow them to run away and hide in some hole. They only hoped that the master of the mountains would not touch them and would spare their lives. Bam K-wi smiled slightly and exhaled slowly. Much to the twins' surprise, Bam K-wi threw the chest containing the night pearl back into their hands. When asked why she was giving them the pearl back, he asked her to sell it so that she would have money to travel with. To the surprised expressions on their faces, Bam K-wi noted that the boys said that they were trying to survive, and as their senior, he couldn't let them go empty-handed. Finally, a slight smile appeared on the boys' faces, and they began to thank him. It was strange because he simply returned to them what he himself had taken. Even despite this, it still seemed that it was worth thanking him. The guy returned back to his camp and woke everyone up and immediately set off on his way. Bam K-wi watched the carts move away and thought about his own things. Mr. Cho and Sol-hwa approached him. The gentleman asked why these people were risking their lives, but Mrs. Baum did not know the answer to this question, since before they immediately gave out all the information. Mr. Cho suggested that there seemed to be some place where all such people gathered. They all agreed that it was no longer their business. Mr. Cho spoke up about the great villains and emphasized that the Alliance of Martial Artists had already crossed all boundaries. Bam K-wi was born to Brother Cho and offered to turn their management to hell. Mr. Cho asked the answer whether he wanted to make a villain out of the Dr. Dan in the world of martial arts. Bam K-wi did not hesitate to answer that they could not do that to the young man. In the morning, the healer Dan received his long-awaited herbs and was very happy about it. He laughed loudly and sincerely thanked all the masters and his aunt for such help. He danced with a chest filled with herbs, which seemed very strange to Mr. Cho. Sol-hwa noted that the healer looked like he had received all the elixirs in the world, and the other masters agreed with her, and all laughed at it. Suddenly, Bam KV cried out and offered to bring the doctor all the elixirs of the world. Mr. Cho noted that it was a good idea, but there were a lot of nuances. The girl asked how he was going to do it. Bam KV replied that he had not thought about that, to which Mr. Cho said that whoever wants will definitely achieve everything, and all that was required was desire. Looking at the happy boy, they started talking about the fact that since they had already decided to do this, they had to find a way. Soon they all reached Xi'an, the capital of Shanxi province. The doors of one of the establishments swung open, and the whole company found itself on the threshold. The doctor glanced at everything and was completely delighted. It was the first time he had seen such a huge tea house and asked if they would be waiting for Mr. Pang here. Mr. Cho said that it was one of the 3 largest tea houses in the entire Shanxi province, and so on. The doctor understood why there were so many people inside. As soon as they all went inside, Mr. Cho immediately sensed something was wrong. Despite the crowd, he did not hear any noise or ringing laughter. The most suspicious thing was how everyone present looked at them strangely. Everyone had icy gazes directed at them and harbored murderous intent. The masters immediately realized that this could be a trap, which all the idiots from the Alliance gathered together. Dr. Dan and his companions finally entered the coffee shop and sat down at one of the tables. Mr. Cho thought that if the people in the coffee shop had some kind of ulterior motive, they would be able to figure it out and react in time. People kept looking back at them and then immediately turned away if the gentleman was looking at them at that moment. Bom Kwi noted that they were apparently not expected, and Sol Hua suggested that they were probably indeed from the Alliance of Martial Artists. A guy appeared at the threshold of the coffee shop and immediately attracted Bom Kvin's attention. He seemed quite familiar to him and he tried to remember who he was. He asked the others if this guy was Samu Sim. The doctor asked if Mr. Cho knew this man. The gentleman replied that he was the ghost of poverty, and everyone in these parts knew him. The gentleman explained that Samu Sim was so stingy that everyone who dealt with him shuddered at his appearance. He was obsessed with money, and his oppression reached such a scale that even Mr. Cho and Mr. Bom did not come close. Mr. Cho was indignant and corrected that he was simply being thrifty, unlike the ghost of poverty. Samu Sim entered the coffee shop, looked around, and immediately headed for the exit, which also seemed quite strange. Following him, all the men in the coffee shop jumped up from their seats and also headed for the exit. Most likely they were waiting for him because as soon as he took out his weapon, they rushed after him. Now the masters understood who the Alliance of Martial Artists was waiting for. Lord Cho said that even though he was following a dark path, the Alliance had no reason to hunt him. Mr. Cho listened and heard the conversations from the next table. After the appearance of the ghost of poverty, the men discussed that they now understood why Lanzhou had been so restless lately. One of them heard that the evil extermination squad had concentrated in these parts to capture the ghost, and then the conversation turned to 100 villains. Bom Kwi noted that the techniques of the ghost of poverty could of course be harsh, but it seemed to him personally that he was a nice guy. As far as he knew, Samu Sim saved more than 1,000 orphans. Mr. Cho sighed. The conversation was still about the 100 villains. Bom Kwi asked what they would do about it or just leave it alone. Ak Ryan emphasized that if they just thoughtlessly interfere, there will be no problems. Suddenly, the owner of the mountains shuddered and groaned. The doctor asked what happened, and he replied that he had a sudden headache because of the very foul smell that was in the coffee shop. Mr. Pang appeared behind him with several people and apologized for being late. The doctor jumped up to greet the gentleman, but froze in place when he saw another group of people with him. The gentleman explained that they were members of the Huashan sect, and they would escort them to the location of the Martial Arts Alliance. Bom Kv said that the smell of thousand-year-old dust was enough for him, and then there was some kind of sect. Mr. Cho, looking at the sect member, emphasized that it was still unknown who was actually accompanying whom. Out of nowhere, another group of people appeared in the coffee pot, apparently with their leader at the head. Mr. Pang shuddered slightly when he saw this man. The man noted that with such eloquent comrades, this long journey would definitely not bore him, and asked to show respect. We note that in front of him were doctors from the Jinson Hospital. One of the guys introduced himself as Ming Jian, the third follower of the Huashan sect, and greeted all the healers of the hospital. Mr. Cho found the name very familiar. He remembered that the heart of the Huashan sect was the 24 Plum Blossom Swordmasters, and Ming Jian was their leader, the chief swordmaster. Ming Jian noted that from now on, he and his men would accompany Mr. Pang and the doctors from Jinsong's hospital to the location of the Martial Arts Alliance. The master was curious that this would be done by the Plum Blossom Swordmasters themselves. The gentleman turned to Mr. Pang and said that even if it was not very comfortable with them, things had not been going well here lately. He asked Mr. Pang to understand that if something bad happened in the city, it would only make the situation worse for their sect. Everyone sat down at the tables. Tea and some cookies were ordered. For some time there was silence at the table. The gentleman turned to the doctor and asked what he was doing in Jinson's hospital. Mr. Pang introduced the doctor as his master's son and named him Dan Ok Sun. The doctor greeted the alliance leader and noted that he would be very pleased to work together. The gentleman was very surprised that the son of a divine physician was in front of him. Lord Pang noted that although the youth was young, his healing techniques were simply amazing, and even he could not compare with him. The leader was very interested in these words because Mr. Pang had better healing techniques than the emperor's doctors, but at the same time, he praised the knowledge of the little boy. Mr. Pang then introduced the masters as employees of his hospital named Ok Gon and Ok Il. The leader smiled, noting that these were the same gentlemen with a good speech thanks to whom they would not be bored. Mr. Pang explained that they rarely left the village because they were constantly learning new techniques, so they lacked communication skills. The leader smiled and replied that there was nothing terrible about it, and the elders living in the inaccessible valleys of their main mountain were not only extremely powerful but also eccentric, but everyone was used to it. Mr. Pang thanked him and was about to introduce another person, but some noise was heard from the street. Something was happening in the yard. They were trying to catch someone. Mr. Cho turned to Mr. Baum and pointed out that they were trying to catch the ghost of poverty in the courtyard, although it had just escaped. The whole situation was very strange. The gentleman asked one of his men what had happened, and he told him that the fighters of the Alliance of Martial Artists had been brought in, who had noticed the ghost of poverty. The gentleman was unhappy that such an event had caused so much noise. Ming Jiang wanted to intervene, but the master asked him not to do so, noting that the territory was not his. The guy apologized to everyone for rushing. The gentleman noted that the main thing was that in their world, there were no enemies and allies. At the moment, they share common interests with the Alliance. The doctor turned to the gentleman and noted that apparently, the grandfather did not approve of the Alliance of Martial Arts Masters. The gentleman did not understand which grandfather was being talked about. The doctor did not answer anything else and waited for an answer, looking with his pure, innocent eyes straight at the master. The gentleman smiled and replied that not everyone had the same goals. He asked how they were different from the Alliance. Ming Jiang intervened and noted that there were too many outsiders in the room, but the gentleman asked when they had ever worried about other people's opinions. Ming Jiang said that he thought he should be wary of those who could distort their words and use it for selfish purposes. The gentleman emphasized that he was simply stating the facts. The Alliance had long since crossed all boundaries. Initially, they wanted to stop all wars in the world of martial arts, but in reality, there was complete chaos. They said that the great grew from the small. Well, it was strange that they did not know that later they would not overcome their dark karma. Bam Kae joined the conversation and said that he thought the gentleman had locked himself in the mountains and knew nothing about the affairs of the martial arts world, but in fact, he was thinking sensibly. Mr. Cho noted that it was necessary for the first follower of the sect to have knowledge of this level. The gentleman smiled and asked for Dan's opinion about the doctor. The young man emphasized that he was still very young and did not know much. He explained that he had been taught that the distinction between political factions was erased the moment a patient needed treatment. The gentleman asked what the words about erasing differences meant, and Ming Jiang thought to herself when this old man would stop asking questions. The gentleman laughed and apologized, saying that if the question was too difficult, he could not answer it. The doctor smiled in response and said that he had asked the question first and meant that the sea was open to all rivers without exception. The gentleman liked this expression, and he smiled and noted that their young doctor apparently wanted to become the sea and asked if he had ever thought about why the sea welcomed and accepted absolutely everyone. The doctor smiled and replied that this was the lowest point. The gentleman was very surprised by the answer and noted that it was a truly profound answer to such a simple question. Ming Jiang was amazed by such an amazing child. I know that the fourth uncle very rarely recognized someone else's talent, but this boy caught his attention. It was such a childish and innocent answer, but it was very difficult to measure the depth of this thought. Another surprising thing was the reaction of his comrades, who seemed to take it for granted and therefore were used to it. The masters were indeed prepared for such an answer, but still smiled, proud of their little healer. The streets were filled with screams again, and they were still trying to catch the ghost of poverty. Bam Kae stood up and explained that he would be coming soon, and Mr. Cho stood up after him. The doctor asked where they were going, a little worried. Ryan replied that his friend had problems and they needed to go together. The ghost of poverty went deep into the forest trying to hide from the people of the Alliance. He looked very shabby. You could tell he had been running for a long time, clinging to branches and possibly even falling. His strength was waning. He didn't know how to get out of this situation. A man jumped out in front of him and tried to convince the attackers not to interfere and to go on their way. Bam Kae and Ryan managed to kill all the people in a matter of minutes and were slowly approaching the ghost of poverty. Bam Kae said that before death, people asked themselves very strange questions and smiled. Samu Sim was trying to catch his breath. He already thought that he would soon die until the masters appeared. Surrounded by the evil destruction squad, and he decided that he was doomed to certain death. Well, where did these two come from and kill absolutely everyone? In battle, they looked exactly like monsters, acting very quickly and cruelly. The biggest fear was instilled by the big guy who seemed to be able to crush any person with just one hand. Samu Sim called them an elusive swordsman and a terrible giant, and did not believe that they came to his aid. The man from the squad tried to defend his position. It is clear that he had no chance at all. Samu Sim was trembling all over and could not accurately predict what would happen in the next moment. The man in front of him turned around and decided that he could manage to do what he was there for. The ghost of poverty prepared for its death, but the blow never came. Right in front of him stood Mr. Cho, although he didn't even know his name. The man protected him from the blow, but he himself was not hurt. The blow literally disappeared without causing any damage. The man from the squad trembled as he saw the man in front of him disperse the ball's energy with his bare hands. Bomb KV stood behind the squad member and reminded his brother that the doctor had forbidden them to use internal energy. The man decided to escape and ran away. He still apparently didn't understand what these two masters were capable of, since he decided that he had a chance of salvation. Bomb KV rushed after him and delivered his blow. Samu Sim confirmed his suspicions by observing the masters. The two of them were able to kill an entire squad and remained completely unharmed. They possessed incredible strength. The ghost of poverty went to meet them and bowed his head, introduced himself, and greeted the sinister martial artist. Bomb KV was surprised that this man could guess. The ghost explained that they were distinguished by their special physique and high-level martial arts. In addition, they were accompanied by a man who addressed them as a brother. Bomb KV asked to stop talking and asked the ghost to remember that they were not here, and he killed the entire squad single-handedly. Mr. Cho noted that the ghost should have been aware that the Martial Arts Alliance was hunting him and asked why he was roaming around so freely. A smile appeared on the ghost's face involuntarily, which angered Ak Ryan. The ghost assured that there was nothing funny and replied that he had to find something where the Alliance was. He was looking for a wooden box. His stash had been robbed, and now he was looking for the Alliance people holding his box. The masters asked what was in the box, and the ghost replied that for ordinary people it was of no value, but for him it was more important than any jewel. Mr. Cho replied that there was nothing more important than his life, and it was worth saving. Samu Sim promised that she would remember this and looked down at the floor. The ghost of poverty bowed as a sign of respect. He was really very grateful to these two for saving him. Mr. Cho decided to ask how the orphans that Musim had saved were doing. The guy smiled and assured them that they were all safe. When leaving, the master was asked to value his life just as he worries about those children and was warned that curiosity never leads to anything good. When the masters left, the ghost looked around and tried to figure out what he was now supposed to do with this. Mr. Baum asked his brother if he had used his internal energy. Mr. Cho replied that he had hardly used any, perhaps just a little bit, concentrating it only on his fingertips. Bomb KV was indignant that he was constantly called a fool, but the leader himself had already forgotten about the doctor's instructions. Ak Ryan replied that he could not dispel that ice energy of the sword with his bare hands, and he had to do it. Returning back to the coffee shop, the masters began to argue again, but at least they were jokingly swearing. And we got back only after dark. Mr. Pang walked around the room in circles trying to think of what he could do. A friend of one of the windows opened and two masters appeared from it. Mr. Cho sharply asked why he was sighing, which greatly frightened Mr. Pang. Ak Ryan asked where the witch had been, and he became slightly worried and nevertheless explained where the girl had disappeared to. Mr. Cho was unhappy that Sol Hua was simply let go. The girl squeezed that she was leaving, and no one knew how to resist it. Now all that was left was to hope that she would not do any mischief. Bomb KV laughed and said that now, when there was no evening, their time had come. He explained that they could now go in search of temptations. Mr. Cho was indignant that Brother Bomb only thought about this, but he assured him that now he only thinks about Dr. Dan. This phrase confused Ak Ryan a little, and he asked again what exactly was meant. At that moment, Bomb KEW picked up Ak Ryan and threw him through the window into the room. He himself ran very quickly, in a direction that was quite well known to Ak Ryan. "Stand on your feet," Mr. Cho asked Mr. Pang not to worry about anything, and promised that he would now return Bomb KY back. Bomb KEV ran to the doctor's bedroom windows and, jumping onto the windowsill, began to wake up the boy. He said that they needed to go somewhere, to which the doctor was surprised that they needed to go somewhere at such an hour. Bomb KW picked up the boy in his arms and replied that they were going to a place where he could become a real man. Han Sol Hua went to talk to Min Jiang. They sat across from each other at the table and drank tea. The girl said that there was no longer any need to accompany them tomorrow and asked Ming Jiang to return, noting that the Huashan sect had shown enough sincerity. Ming Jiang apologized and explained that he could not make such decisions on his own and was simply following the orders of his sect. The girl asked what to do if her squad was uncomfortable because of them and called the guy a stubborn child. Min Jiang didn't like this. He emphasized that he hadn't been a child for a long time, although he thought to himself how young he looked that he was called that. The guy reminded that he never introduced himself and gave his name and position, emphasizing that he was 20 years old. The young man wanted to know the girl's name and age in response, but she did not allow him to find out. The girl replied that it was not customary to ask women such questions. Ming Jiang still didn't fully understand the essence of their dialogue and what this girl was trying to achieve. So Hua took a sip of tea and said that they shouldn't have been accompanied from the start because a rabbit couldn't protect a tiger. The young man simply let the next few sentences pass through his ears without hearing a word. The girl noticed this and asked him to come back and listen to what she was saying. The young man shuddered slightly and, coming to his senses, noted that the girl was too stern. He said that if you asked someone to name the top 100 greatest martial artists in the world today, every cherry blossom swordsman would definitely make the list. Sol Hua replied that she was familiar with that look and asked if the young man was the leader of the cherry blossom swordsmen. The girl remembered out loud that once the same swordsman told her that if he could win her heart, he would give up his meaningless position in all claims. She said that he constantly clung to her, promising to leave the sect and return to a peaceful life. And Ming Jiang's gaze was exactly like his. Ming Jiang jumped up and shouted that this was all nonsense. He knew that the previous squad leader was his master, and he did not believe that he was such a person. He asked the girl not to even try to defile his master's honor with such slander. Sol Hua answered very calmly that she was not lying at all. Ming Jiang threatened that this was his last warning, and the Huashan sect would not tolerate insults. The girl asked whether he would have stopped the escort if this had turned out to be true. The guy demanded that the girl take responsibility for her words, and the girl asked with a slight laugh how she should have done it. After thinking for a bit, the girl suggested that if she lied, she would fulfill one of his wishes. The young man thought for a while. He calmed down and asked the girl to allow his squad to continue to accompany her and her friends. What a wish the witch was surprised by. Ming Jiang noted that the dispute had to be fair and said that now his master was in Xi'an, the home of the Alliance of Martial Artists, on an important mission, and the truth would be revealed very soon. He shouted to his men and ordered the cherry blossom swordsmen to immediately go to the master and report what they had heard. The girl wasn't worried at all and just smiled. She suggested that we wait for the results together and drink some more tea. Bom K.We took Dan aka to a place where he thought he could have fun for the first time. Several girls lined up in front of him, very well groomed and pleasant looking, smiling slyly and shooting their eyes. After thinking for a bit, the doctor chose one of the girls. Bom Kev laughed that his doctor was a real man. Danak approached the girl and took her hand. After feeling the girl's hand a little, he also wanted to choose the gentleman standing next to him. The old man grimaced with disgust and replied that he was the owner of this establishment. Mr. Baum also grimaced at the tastes of the doctor, since he chose an elderly man. The young man approached the old man and took him by the hand and asked him to answer whether he had been bothered by headaches lately, especially before going to bed, as if his temples were being pierced by thousands of needles. The old man was shocked but agreed that he had indeed had such pains. The doctor asked if they measured the old man's hands in the morning. The old man was very excited by such questions and did not understand how the young man knew about this because he was sure that he had never told anyone about this. The doctor threw up his hands and noted that if they had come a little later, everything could have turned out much worse. He asked if there was a quiet room somewhere to start treatment immediately and asked the man not to worry. The girls whispered among themselves, admiring the young guest more and more with each passing second. Danak began to feel out some of the girls while a quiet room was being prepared for the owner of the establishment. Mr. Baum began to shout at the young man that this was not a hospital, but it was too late. Soon, Master Ming Jiang returned after completing his special assignment. Ming Jiang met him. He was very impatiently waiting for his master to finally get the truth. The master's face showed no emotion. He only asked who dared to insult him. Ming Jiang pointed to the girl sitting at the table and replied that he was insulted by her, a guest from Jinson's hospital who came with the Dr. Peng. As soon as the master looked at the girl, he immediately realized that he had seen her somewhere before. He looked into her face and his features were so familiar. His body shook. He couldn't believe his eyes. The girl smiled and noted that this was the same brat she was talking about. The master's face froze. He didn't know what to say and in general couldn't even do it for some time. He came closer to the table where the girl was sitting and introduced himself as a martial arts student and the second follower of Huashan, and greeted the Immortal song. Ming Jiang didn't understand what was going on because his master never called himself a disciple. The witch looked at the master and smiled slightly when she heard what he said. The girl asked the master, where was that little boy who loved to rub his cheek against her dress? The master leaned against the table and bowed his head and asked to be careful with his words because his student was in the hall. The girl smiled and said that they had quarreled with his student. The master tensed up when he heard about the dispute. The girl smiled and asked the master if she had lied. Exhaling heavily, the master replied that everything that the immortal son had said was true, understanding the situation he was putting himself in before his student. The girl turned to Ming Jiang and asked if she had won the sport, and having received confirmation, asked what would happen to her escort. Ming Jiang nodded and promised that he would call everyone back immediately. The girl got up from the table and, passing by the master, noted that the child who had washed himself with his palms had grown so much. Without letting the girl leave, the master called out to her, but the girl did not stop and left the hall. The master was breathing heavily and suddenly sat down at the table in a fit of weakness. Ming Jiang couldn't believe his eyes and ears and asked the master who this girl was. He said that she was the ice jade of immortality in the world of martial arts. She was a true legend. The student was surprised that she was from the past generation, to which the master noted that the girl did not look her age at all and was able to achieve eternal youth. The disciple did not believe that the girl was actually telling the truth and that his master really wanted to leave the sect because of a woman. The master answered with difficulty that everything was a lie. The student did not understand anything and asked why the master then said back. He replied that it was not about him. Ming Jiang stopped understanding anything and did not understand then who was being talked about in general, if not the master. After thinking for a while, Ming Jiang, comparing that the girl was from the previous generation, realized that it was about the leader of the Cherry Blossom sect. Not wanting to answer any more questions, the master asked his student to forget everything that was heard in this room that day. Mr. Cho tried to find Bom Kai-win with Dr. Dan. He thought that given Bom Kai-win's character, he went to the most expensive brothel. And at that moment, Mr. Bom himself appeared out of nowhere. Ak Ryan was very scared by how unexpectedly his friend appeared. Seeing that the doctor was on his shoulders, he was worried that he was ill, but he worried in vain. Bom Kai-wee, almost crying, said that if he could only be reborn, he would give up martial arts and study medicine. When Mr. Cho asked what had happened, Bom Kai-wee pointed to the brothel where a crowd of girls were seeing off the doctor and shouting their gratitude to him. You stood with them and the owner of this establishment, who also said goodbye to the Dr. Dan with gratitude. Mr. Cho was surprised that the doctor was able to cure them all, to which Mr. Bom replied that even though they did not receive any income because of them, they still thanked him and even paid. When the immortal song found out where the boys had been, she became furious, believing that they had most likely given the child alcohol. The masters stood there like teenagers and tried to justify themselves by saying that none of them had been drinking and that everything had gone very civilized. When asked why they went with Dan then, Bom Kai-wee replied that he used his body too actively. The master clearly did not think about what he was saying. The girl was about to explode with anger. Everything around began to freeze and Mr. Cho decided to intervene and promised to explain everything. When Mr. Cho told everything, the girl calmed down and said that it was worth starting the conversation with exactly this. Ak Ryan also asked a question about how everything went at the meeting with the blossoming cherry. The girl said that she managed to dissuade them and they recalled the swordsman. Ak Ryan did not quite believe that a powerful sect had taken and listened to her. The girl grinned and replied that of course they listened to her, otherwise it was not even expected. The dark night passed and at dawn life began again. Mr. Pang walked up to Dan's bedroom door and asked if he was asleep. When he looked into the room, he froze for a moment in the doorway, slightly surprised by what he saw. In the middle of the room sat the Dr. Dan, and around him sat Mr. Cho, Mr. Bom, and Mrs. Han. They were all undergoing acupuncture. The doctor was completely focused on his work and was not distracted by extraneous sounds. He tried very hard and was worried, which is why he was sweating so much, as drops of sweat flowed down to the floor at his feet. Mr. Pang entered the room and, closing the door behind him, began to wait for the young lord to pay attention to him. Having finished with another needle, the young man wiped the sweat from his forehead with his hand and greeted the gentleman. Mr. Pang noted that the boy worked hard and asked permission to look at his work. He walked up to Bom Kai-win and examined his back and the location of the needles on it. The gentleman was surprised that the boy used both parents' acupuncture techniques. The doctor smiled and replied that he had been studying this for a long time, but only recently had he finally begun to see results. The gentleman was very interested in this technology, but it could not be said that he fully approved of it. Dr. Dan was a little upset that the gentleman said that it could only be a theory because the boy saw the results and besides it did not give any side effects. The gentleman smiled and asked who else would dare to try such a thing if not the Lord of the Valley, and explained that that is why he said that such a thing was only possible in theory, because even he himself would be afraid to do such a thing. The gentleman noted that if the needle had gone even a millimeter deeper, people could have been paralyzed. Hearing this, Bom Kewe became very tense. The gentleman also warned that if the boy guided the needle at the wrong angle, people could also lose their hearing. At this point, Ak Ryan himself became tense. The slightest mistake could lead to loss of vision. The gentleman said that his hands were shaking, and he would not even dare to use acupuncture. The doctor saw that his patients were getting nervous and strictly ordered them not to move. The doctor asked what brought Mr. Pang to him at such an hour, and he replied that they should hurry. He said that a letter had arrived from the head of the Martial Arts Masters Alliance himself, stating that the patient's condition was rapidly deteriorating.